In the end, the U.S. victory in the Battle of Midway ended Japan's expansionary aspirations in the Pacific, forcing them into a defensive posture until their surrender on September 2nd, 1945. And there you have it, the Battle of Midway, today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, the rape of Nanking. During the Second Sino-Japanese War, over 20 million Chinese civilians perished due to attrition or massacres by Japanese forces. The most famous and brutal of these, which still remains an obstacle in Sino-Japanese relations to this day, was the Nanking Massacre of 1937, also known as the Rape of Nanking. After war broke out in July of 1937, by December of that same year, Japanese forces had closed in on Nanking, which at the time was the capital of the Republic of China. Chinese forces were quickly overwhelmed by the Japanese, prompting Chinese leader Chiang Kai-shek to order a full retreat. Many soldiers dressed as civilians to blend in, which prompted Japanese commanding officer Prince Asaka to encourage his men to actively engage in rape, murder, torture, theft, and arson. Beginning on December 17, 1937, and lasting for 6 blood-soaked weeks, foreign journalists and other observers witnessed the wholesale gang rape and slaughter of Chinese civilians and military personnel alike. For the 2 decades leading up to the Second Sino-Japanese War, most people in Japan saw the Chinese as an inferior race, which infused a further contributory motive to the genocide at Nanking. After Japan's surrender following the Second World War, historians have been unable to accurately estimate the death toll at Nanking due to the destruction or disappearance of Japanese military records. But in 1946, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East estimated 200,000 casualties during the 6-week rape of Nanking, while the Chinese Nanking War Crimes Tribunal of 1947 placed the death toll higher at 300,000 lives. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East further estimated that 1,000 women were gang raped each and every day of the occupation, as Japanese soldiers went door to door searching for girls. Most were killed immediately after being raped, often including gruesome mutilations of their bodies. The Reverend James M. McCallum wrote in his diary, "People are hysterical. Women are being carried off every morning, afternoon, and evening. The whole Japanese army seems to be free to go and come as it pleases, and to do whatever it pleases." After the surrender of Japan in 1945, the principal commanding officers in charge of Japanese troops in Nanking were put on trial. General Matsui was indicted and executed for deliberately and recklessly ignoring his legal duty to prevent breaches of the Hague Convention, while Hisao Tani was tried and executed by the Nanking War Crimes Tribunal. Other commanders had died during Japan's subsequent involvement in World War II, while Prince Asaka was granted immunity from prosecution due to his status as a member of the imperial family. Isamu Chao, an aide to Asaka, and the person many historians believe issued a "kill all captives" memo to Japanese troops at Nanking, had committed ritual suicide during the Battle of Okinawa. And there you have it, the rape of Nanking, today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, the Iran hostage crisis. During the Iranian Revolution of 1979, violent protests by Muslim college students forced the Shah of Iran, Reza Pahlavi, to flee his homeland for the United States, where he was admitted on compassionate grounds for cancer treatment at the New York Hospital Cornell Medical Center. On February 1st, 1979, after 15 years in exile, Shiite religious leader Ayatollah Khomeini was returned to power by jubilant Iranian revolutionaries, eager to see the return of Islamic Sharia law. Believing that the United States was meddling in Iranian affairs, including perceived attempts to undermine the Iranian Revolution, on November 4, 1979, members of the Muslim student followers of the Imam's line stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, taking 52 American diplomats and citizens hostage for the next 444 days of forced captivity. While President Jimmy Carter froze billions of Iranian assets in the United States, his inability to act decisively during the Iran hostage crisis heavily contributed to his landslide loss to Ronald Reagan in the presidential election of 1980. In September 1980, after the Iraqi military invaded Iran, the start of the Iran-Iraq War hastened the Iranians to the negotiation table with the Americans. Mere hours after Ronald Reagan was sworn into office, the newly minted president signed the Algiers Accords, which repatriated the hostages back to the United States the following day. Since the release of the hostages, Iran and the United States continue to have no formal diplomatic relations, other than puppet diplomacy between Pakistan, who serves as Iran's protecting power, while Switzerland serves as the United States' protective power in Iran. And there you have it, the Iran hostage crisis, today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, the Berlin airlift. After Berlin fell to the Russians in May of 1945, Germany lay powerless as the victorious Allies carved up the nation into 4 zones of occupation, including the 4 control zone sectors in Berlin, which as a whole lay in the Soviet sector. 3 years later, another battle would be fought in Berlin, this time a battle of political ideology, as well as the first significant chapter in the 43-year-long Cold War. For the first 2 months after the surrender of Germany, the Russians were the sole occupiers of Berlin, who made sincere strides to get the bombed-out and war-weary citizens of Berlin back on their feet again. On July 1, 1945, American, French, and British garrisons moved into their sectors of the city, and while comradeship between the victors of World War II appeared amicable at first, conflict soon began to erode trust between the Soviets and the Western powers. The Russians proposed that the biggest socialist party of Germany should combine with the Communist Party, but the socialists in the Western sector insisted on putting the issue to a vote, suspecting that unity with the Communists would eventually lead to unity under the Communists. The majority vote turned away from the Soviets, and since the Soviets had suffered egregious losses to German aggression in both world wars, Stalin was determined to turn Eastern Europe into a buffer zone to protect Russia from future Aryan hostilities. After the United States, France, and Britain combined their sectors of Germany to create a separate Western state, the days of participation between the Soviets and Western powers rapidly disintegrated. When the Western powers replaced the grossly inflated German currency with the Deutschmark, a currency that was only valid in West Germany, the first major act of the Cold War was officially on. On June 24, 1948, the Russians stopped all rail service into and out of West Berlin, while on August 24th, Autobahn and canal links were also blockaded, with the hope of starving Western powers out of Germany once and for all. In response, American and British air crews, along with 5 other lesser-involved Allied powers, began airlifting supplies for the 2 million Germans living in West Berlin, a monumental supply line feat that lasted until the Soviets ended their blockade on September 30, 1949. While the original plan called for 3,476 tons of supplies delivered daily, by the spring of 1949, that number would peak at 12,941 daily tons of coal and inbound essentials. The U.S. Air Force delivered 1,783,573 tons of supplies, while the RAF delivered 541,937 tons. The Berlin airlift flew over 92 million miles, while at the height of the operation, 1 cargo plane landed in West Berlin every 30 seconds. The Berlin blockade served to highlight the competing ideological visions for post-war Europe, while playing a major role in drawing West Germany into NATO's orbit several years later in 1955. And there you have it, the Berlin airlift, today on the Daily Dose. Today in the Daily Dose, the Battle of the Bulge. Called the greatest American battle of the war by Winston Churchill, the Battle of the Bulge in the Ardennes region of Belgium was Hitler's last major offensive in World War II against the Western Front. Lasting 6 brutal weeks in raw winter conditions, from December 16, 1944 to January 25, 1945, some 30 German divisions attacked battle-weary American troops across 85 miles of densely wooded forest. When the Nazis' unexpected offensive swept into the Ardennes, the Allied line buckled and pulled back in the appearance of a large herniated bulge, which gave the battle its everlasting name. The formerly serene region of Ardennes was hacked to pieces by brutal fighting against the German advance at St. Vith, Elsenborn Ridge, Helfalize, and Bastogne, leading U.S. Army soldier Charlie Sanderson to write of the event. Did you ever see land when a tornado's come through? Did you ever see trees and stuff twisted and broken off? The whole friggin' forest was like that. Belgian townspeople put away their Allied flags and brought out their swastikas, not knowing which side would ultimately win the battle. Hitler's mid-December blitzkrieg banked heavily on the strategic nature of bad weather, subjecting American troops to freezing rain, thick fog, deep snowdrift, and record-breaking low temperatures, resulting in more than 15,000 cold injuries, such as trench foot, pneumonia, and frostbite. I was from Buffalo. I thought I knew cold reflects Baseball Hall of Famer and World War II veteran Warren Spahn, but I didn't really know cold until the Battle of the Bulge. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower and George S. Patton Jr. led the American offensive to restore the weakened front, sending in 230,000 soldiers and airborne units into Bastogne, where the Germans had surrounded thousands of Allied troops. When the Germans sent a message demanding the surrender of the 101st Airborne Division on December 22, 1944, they got a one-word answer from its commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, and that word was nuts. 3 days later, Patton's Third Army finally arrived to push back the German line and rescue the surrounded troops. Germany's failure to divide American forces embedded in the Ardennes paved the way to victory for the Allies, but only at an egregiously high price. 1 million plus Allied troops fought in the Battle of the Bulge, with approximately 19,000 soldiers killed in action, 47,500 wounded, and 23,000 plus missing and forever unaccounted for. The Germans suffered almost matching losses, making the Battle of the Bulge one of the bloodiest events of the war. And there you have it, the Battle of the Bulge, today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, Amelia Earhart flies the pond. Born into a wealthy family in Atchison, Kansas, on July 24, 1897, Amelia Earhart developed a passion for adventure at an early age, steadily gaining flying experience from her 20s onward until her disappearance in 1937 during a Pacific Ocean flight from Lae, New Guinea to Howland Island. Nicknamed Lady Lindy after Charles Lindbergh's 1927 solo flight across the Atlantic, the following year, Earhart became the first woman to fly the Atlantic with pilot Vilmer Stoltz and co-pilot and flight mechanic Lewis Gordon, departing from Trepassey Harbor, Newfoundland, in a Fokker F-7B, landing near Buryport, South Wales 20 hours and 40 minutes later. Since most of the flight was on instruments and Earhart had no training yet for that type of flying, when asked by a reporter if she helped fly the plane, she answered, "Stoltz did all the flying, had to. I was just baggage, like a sack of potatoes. Maybe someday I'll try it alone." She did just that 5 years to the day after Lucky Lindy's flight across the pond, flying from Newfoundland to Ireland in just under 15 hours. On the morning of May 20th, 1932, 34-year-old Earhart set off from Harbor Grace with a copy of the Telegraph Journal newspaper given to her by a reporter to confirm the date of her flight in a Lockheed Vega 5B. After contending with strong northerly winds, icy conditions, and mechanical problems, Earhart landed in a pasture in Culmore, Northern Ireland. The landing was witnessed by Cecil King and T. Sawyers, and when a farmhand asked, "Have you flown far?" Earhart replied, "From America." And there you have it. Amelia Earhart flies the pond. Today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, the Battle of Guadalcanal. When Japanese troops swept onto Guadalcanal in June of 1942, followed by American Marines 2 months later, intent on removing the enemy from the island, few people outside of Polynesia had ever heard of this 2,000 square mile speck of jungle in the Solomon Islands. Over the next 6 months, Guadalcanal and its neighboring islands would prove to be a critical turning point between the Allies and their Japanese adversaries during World War II. Surprised by the Allies' offensive, the Japanese made determined attempts between August and November to retake the airfield they had begun to build on Guadalcanal. The campaign would involve 3 major land battles fought in dense jungle conditions, 7 pivotal naval battles, 5 nighttime surface actions and 2 carrier battles, and almost daily aerial dogfights that lasted until early November, when the Japanese made their last-ditch attempt to land enough troops on Guadalcanal to retake their geographically strategic yet uncompleted airbase. In December, the Japanese surrendered their efforts to retake the island, evacuating the last of their remaining forces on February 7, 1943. The Battle of Guadalcanal followed the successful Allied defensive actions at the Battle of the Coral Sea and the Battle of Midway in May and June of 1942. Along with the battles of Milne Bay and Bunagona, the Guadalcanal campaign marked the Allies' transition from defensive operations to offensive superiority, effectively seizing the strategic initiative in the Pacific theater of operations. While the Japanese were clearly in a defensive rather than an expansionary mode after their losses at Guadalcanal, they continued to fight with extreme ferocity during the Solomon Islands campaign, the New Guinea campaign, the Gilbert and Marshall Islands campaign, the Maria and Palau Islands campaign, as well as the attacks on the Japanese islands of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The Japanese would finally surrender on September 2, 1945, after the Americans dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima on August 6th, followed 3 days later with a second nuclear detonation at Nagasaki. And there you have it, the Battle of Guadalcanal, today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, the Great London Smog of 1952. Beginning on December 5th, 1952, and lasting for the next 5 miserable days, Londoners choked in a dense blanket of smog that killed many and sickened many more. Known as pea soupers, London had suffered smog events since the 13th century, reaching a peak in the 1600s. But the Great Smog of 1952 is still considered the worst air pollution event in the history of the United Kingdom. The incident would trigger a significant increase in environmental research, government regulation, and the public's awareness of the relationship between air quality and health. Caused by a vicious cold snap that forced Londoners to burn more coal than usual, the increase in air pollution combined with an anticyclone weather pattern that brought any chance of a freshening breeze to a standstill. To make matters worse, post-war domestic coal consumption in the UK tended to be of the relatively low-grade, sulfurous kind, since the better quality or hard coals such as anthracite were exported out of the country to help pay down the nation's debt caused by the Second World War. As a result, the cheaper burning coal increased the amount of sulfur dioxide emitting from coal-burning power plants, such as the Battersea Power Station, filling the air with dense particulates of hydrochloric acid, fluorine, sulfur dioxide, and sulfuric acid. Once visibility had reduced to under 10 feet, the London Underground was forced to shut down, along with basic services such as ambulance response and garbage collection. Concert halls and movie theaters were shuttered, along with all outdoor sporting events. The blanket of dense even closed doors and windows, invading homes and businesses, leaving Londoners helpless to get away from the choking smog. Walking at night became a near impossibility, since the fluorescent streetlights of the time were made useless by the oppressive air. In the end, the Great London Smog took the lives of 6,000 to 12,000 Londoners, while badly sickening as many as 100,000 more. On the 9th of December, a welcoming breeze picked up and blew the smog out to sea, letting Londoners breathe easy again for the first time in days. And there you have it, the Great London Smog of 1952. Today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, the French sink their own navy. Following the Allies' successful invasion of French North Africa, Nazi leaders reneged on their armistice of 1940 with Vichy France, setting in motion operations Anton and Lille with the intent of capturing French warships and submarines for use against Allied naval assets. Long before the Germans set their sights on the French fleet, British and American leaders feared such a takeover by the Nazis, obliging the British to attack the French Navy at Mer el Kabir on July 3, 1940, followed by the Battle of Dakar on September 23 of that same year. On November 11, 1942, German and Italian troops closed in on the French coastal city of Toulon, home to the French fleet, which triggered Vichy Secretary of the Navy Admiral Gabriel Ophon to order Admirals Jean de Laborde and André Marquis to oppose the invading armies without bloodshed by means of local negotiation. If that failed, his orders went on, then the admirals were obliged to scuttle their ships in port or at sea. Long before the impending attack by the Germans and the Italians, the French Navy had strengthened Toulon's defenses against an anticipated attack by Allied forces, which included a premeditated game plan for scuttling the fleet if an Allied attack was deemed imminent. On November 27, 1942, 4 German combat groups and a motorcycle battalion entered the Greater Toulon area at 4 a.m., catching Vichy officers completely by surprise, but not before one of the officers transmitted the order to Admiral Laborde to scuttle the fleet as quickly as possible. Scuttle, 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 the order went out from Laborde's station on the battleship Strasbourg, prompting scuttling crews to set demolition charges and open sea valves on as many ships as possible. The Germans' main force got lost on the foreign roads surrounding Toulon, giving the French a full hour's head start. And when the Germans finally reached the gates of the naval base, French sentries further delayed their entry with the fabricated need for additional paperwork. In the end, of the 164 vessels in the French fleet, 77 were successfully scuttled, while 3 destroyers, 4 submarines, and 39 small ships were captured by the Germans, costing the lives of 12 French combatants and wounding 26 others. The Germans, in turn, would suffer only 1 wounded soldier during the assault on Toulon Harbor. And there you have it. The French sink their own navy. Today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, the Summer of Love. Egged on by the Beat Generation poets and novelists of the 1950s, a group that flourished in the North Beach community of San Francisco, the Summer of Love hippie movement sprang to life after the Human Be-In held in Golden Gate Park on January 14, 1967, when acid guru Timothy Leary coined the phrase, "Turn on, tune in, and drop out." By the summer of 1967, more than 100,000 like-minded flower children migrated from around the country to the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco, vibing on hippie music, psychedelic drugs, anti-war sentiment, and an overwhelming spirit of free love. After Les Paul invented the electric guitar, the baby boom generation of the 1960s gravitated toward amplified rock and roll music, which was in direct conflict to the gentle swing-era dance tunes of their parents' generation. Flower children embraced a heavy mistrust of the government and the capitalistic ways of their parents, forming non-consumerist communal groups like the Diggers, who established a free store and a free medical clinic, while psychedelic drug groups like novelist Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters through acid tests intended to unvalve the minds of the once staid, largely suburban, middle-class youth. In the spring of 1967, the Council for the Summer of Love was created by the communal groups The Family Dog, The Diggers, The Straight Theater, and the hippie newspaper The San Francisco Oracle, who sought to alleviate some of the problems anticipated from the influx of hippies expected to descend on Haight-Ashbury as the summer bore down. The council lent support to the Diggers Free Clinic before organizing housing, food, sanitation, and links to local churches and social groups. When spring break came around, thousands of high school and college students descended on the Haight, causing alarm among San Francisco authorities. But once school ended for the summer, the onslaught pressed into high gear. Radical journalist Hunter S. Thompson called the Haight-Ashbury in an article in the New York Times Magazine, which further inspired more hippies to migrate west to San Francisco. Music festivals further ignited the Summer of Love, including the Fantasy Fair and Magic Mountain Music Festival, as well as the Monterey Pop Festival, which drew hippies to the electrified sounds of The Who, The Grateful Dead, The Animals, Jefferson Airplane, Jimi Hendrix, and Janis Joplin. After the mass departure of hippies at the end of the summer, a mock Summer of Love funeral was held by organizer Mary Casper, who issued a call to arms for all departed hippies, encouraging them to bring the revolution to wherever they called home. As Grateful Dead guitarist Bob Weir commented, Haight-Ashbury was a ghetto of bohemians who wanted to do anything, and we did, but I don't think it has happened again since. Yes, there was LSD, but Haight-Ashbury was not about drugs. It was about exploration, finding new ways of expression, and being aware of one's existence. And there you have it, the Summer of Love, today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, the Battle of Britain. After the Germans had rapidly overwhelmed France and the Low Countries of Europe, the Nazis set their sights on the overthrow of Great Britain. Heralded as the first major military campaign fought entirely by air forces, the Battle of Britain ignited on July 10, 1940, before terrorizing the British for the next nearly 4 months to come. Fought between the German Luftwaffe, the British Royal Air Force, and the British Navy's Fleet Air Army, Hitler's primary objective for the campaign was to compel Britain to agree to a negotiated peace settlement. Targeting coastal shipping convoys, ports, and shipping centers such as Portsmouth, on August 1st, the Luftwaffe was directed to achieve air superiority over the RAF, with the aim of incapacitating the RAF Fighter Command. 12 days later, it shifted their attacks to RAF airfields and infrastructure, which included the attempted destruction of British aircraft production facilities. After both German objectives failed, the Nazis shifted their focus to terror bombing raids over British cities, hoping that the resultant public outcry and political pressure would force politicians to capitulate. On July 16, 1940, Hitler ordered that preparations be made for Operation Sea Lion, which was the planned amphibious and airborne assault on Great Britain. In September, however, the RAF Bomber Command disrupted the Nazis' invasion plans during a series of punishing night raids on a flotilla of converted barges being outfitted for the coastal invasion of Britain. Combined with the Luftwaffe's failure to gain air superiority over the Brits, Hitler abruptly canceled all plans for Operation Sea Lion. Historian Stephen Bungay cited Germany's failure to destroy Britain's air defenses as the first major German defeat in World War II, while injecting a crucial turning point in the conflict in Europe. The Battle of Britain takes its name from a speech given by Prime Minister Winston Churchill to the House of Commons on June 18, 1940, when he said, When General Weygand called the Battle of France over, I suspect that the Battle of Britain is about to begin. The Battle of Britain would see 1,964 airmen casualties for the British, while the Germans suffered casualties of 4,245. 14,286 British civilians were killed during the 4-month running campaign, while an additional 20,325 British civilians were wounded. Despite these egregious losses, the victory in favor of Britain provided an enormous morale boost for the nation, emboldening their confidence that they could and would successfully defend themselves from Nazi aggression. And there you have it, the Battle of Britain, today in the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, United Airlines Flight 629. On November 1st, 1955, United Airlines Flight 629, also known as the Mainliner Denver, boarded 39 passengers and 5 crew members for its scheduled flight from Denver Stapleton Field for stops in Portland and Seattle. At 7:03 p.m., less than 11 minutes into the flight, controllers at Stapleton lost the flight from their radar scopes, noting a large bright flash in the distant night sky, somewhere over Longmont, Colorado. When investigators arrived at the scene of the crash, no survivors could be found amongst the strewn wreckage. One of the deceased passengers was Daisy Graham, and within days, investigators arrested her son, John Gilbert Graham, for the mass murder of the passengers and crew of Flight 629. By planning a dynamite time bomb in his mother's checked luggage, John Graham was hoping to cash in on a life insurance policy he had purchased in the airport terminal just prior to his mother's departure. The face value of the policy was a mere $37,500, which in today's money would equal around $360,000, the going price, it seemed, for the lives of 44 innocent victims. As the backstory unfolded, investigators would learn that John's mother, Daisy, had given him up for adoption when her second husband and John's father died from pneumonia. Daisy's third husband died shortly after their marriage began, allowing the widow to open a successful restaurant when she inherited his money. While Daisy never made any attempts to collect her abandoned son from the orphanage, John and his mother reunited when he was 22 years old. In 1955, the same year as the plane crash, a suspicious gas explosion burned Daisy's restaurant to the ground, leading investigators to discover that John Graham had pocketed that insurance money as well. 18 months after the downing of Flight 629, John Gilbert Graham would be executed for the mass murder of all those aboard the ill-fated flight. And there you have it, the downing of Flight 629, today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, the history of Veterans Day. When World War I ended in 1918, at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, Armistice Day, as Veterans Day was originally known, was first celebrated on the first anniversary of the conclusion of the war to end all wars. While Memorial Day celebrates American servicemen who sacrificed everything for their country, Veterans Day, or Remembrance Day as it is known in many other countries, pays tribute to all veterans, both living and deceased, who served their country honorably during times of war and peace. In America, the nation's first unknown soldier was laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery on Armistice Day, 1921. Since that first memorial, other unknown soldiers from America's wars have been interred in the memorial, and it's become tradition for the president or one of his representatives to lay a wreath on the tomb every November 11th. In 1926, 8 years after the end of the First World War, Congress passed a resolution calling for an annual observance of Armistice Day to honor the veterans who fought so hard for the nation's freedom and peace. The idea caught on, and by 1938, the day was marked by so many ceremonies and parades that Congress made Armistice Day a legal holiday. After World War II and the Korean War, Americans wanted to open up the holiday, not just for World War I veterans, but for all veterans who served their country with courage and honor. In 1954, President Dwight D. Eisenhower officially changed the name of the holiday from Armistice Day to Veterans Day, while in 1968, Congress passed the Uniform Holidays Act, which moved the celebration of Veterans Day to the fourth Monday in October. The law went into effect in 1971 until President Gerald Ford returned Veterans Day to November 11th due to the historical significance of the date. As of 2018, the United States was home to 18.2 million living veterans who served during at least one war. During America's involvement in her last 4 wars, 16 million Americans served during World War II, with just under 500,000 still alive as of 2018. Just under 6 million veterans served during the Korean War, with some 2 million still alive, while approximately 2.7 million served during the Vietnam War, with 610,000 still alive as of 2019. Most recently, 3 million veterans have served in support of the war on terrorism, making American veterans an ongoing vital asset to the nation's safety and security, both at home and abroad. Hoorah! Hooyah! Hooah! And there you have it, the history of Veterans Day. Today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, the pagan origins of Halloween. Halloween is more popular than it's ever been, a time of year when people act and dress in ways they'd never imagine in any other day of the year. Well, most of us anyway. But instead of Darth Vader masks and Spidey suits, the pagan tradition of Halloween goes back 3,000 years to the Celtic tribes of Ireland, when people peered into the world of dark spirits on this most magical of nights. Centuries before Christ, tribes of Celtic people flourished throughout Ireland, the British Isles, and France. Their sustenance came largely from agricultural husbandry, which made the coming of winter the scariest time of their collective lives. Once their crops were harvested, there was a communal sense that this was all they had to carry them through the barren days of winter, giving the Celts a commonly felt swallow of trepidation. In the pagan tradition, as winter approached, the Celts asked their priests, known as Druids, to pray for them, and the most important prayers fell on the last day of the harvest, known as Samhain, which kicked off a 3-day observance of All Hallowtide to remember the saints, or Hallows as they were known, and all the faithful who had departed this earth. Beginning on All Hallows Eve, it was on this night, now called Halloween, that the Celts believed that the world between the living and the dead was unusually thin or close together. So thin that the souls of the dead and the souls of the living could roam freely between each other in a spiritual epiphany of everlasting life. On Samhain night only, the Celts believed that those who had died in the past year walked the earth once more, but not every visiting ghost was deemed friendly. So the Celts devised ways to appease these less civilized spirits, amassing at the edges of their villages with rituals and offerings, attempting to lure evil spirits away from their homes. They would leave food and sweets outside as gifts for the dead, a tradition that would eventually become trick-or-treating. A world away in ancient Rome, a similar tradition formed, known as Pomona, in celebration of the goddess of gardens and fruits. Known in Latin America as the Day of the Dead, or Dia de Muertos, the Celts' early Samhain tradition has morphed into Halloween, when modern-day celebrants dress up and perform mischief and pranks, largely unaware of the night's pagan roots and significance in pre-Christian human history. Like a snow day from school, Halloween allows young and grown alike to shed their inhibitions and let their imaginations run wild, leaving fear and reality at the door for a night of unabashed childlike mischief and play. And there you have it. Samhain morphs into Halloween. Today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, the Hungarian Uprising of 1956. After suffering egregious losses to the Germans in both world wars, after the Huns' second defeat in 1945, the Soviet Union imposed their will over their Eastern Satellite Bloc countries in an effort to buffer Mother Russia from future Germanic aggression. Fed up by communist shortages and Soviet-imposed policies, on October 23, 1956, student protesters marched through central Budapest to the Hungarian Parliament building. Quickly detained by Soviet-backed police, when protesters outside the Parliament building called for the students' release, they were fired upon by the State Security Police, or AVO as they were known. After the dead were draped in Hungarian flags and paraded through the streets of Budapest, thousands of Hungarians organized into militias and went to war against the AVO and an invasion of Soviet troops. During the revolt, AVO members and local leaders sympathetic to Soviet rule were captured and lynched, while former political prisoners were released and armed for the fight. After Hungary's initial victory over the Soviets, a sense of liberation and freedom from communist oppression swept through the country. By the end of October, fighting had almost ceased, and days of tranquil normality began to return. A new government was hastily formed behind revolutionary leader Imre Nagy, who quickly disbanded AVO while pledging to re-establish free elections. With growing unrest in several other Eastern Bloc satellite countries, desperate Soviet leaders needed to set an example. And after rumors began to circulate that Nagy intended to withdraw from the Warsaw Pact, the Eastern European military alliance solely controlled by the Soviet Union, on Thursday, November the 4th, Soviet tanks and troops poured back across the Hungarian border, intending to crush the rebellion once and for all. This time, the battle would prove to be bloody and one-sided, for wherever belligerents were discovered, entire buildings were brought down to swiftly end pockets of resistance. While there were diplomatic protests from the free capitalist West, the world looked on in muted silence as the Soviets reimposed their will over Hungary. While Nagy fled to the Yugoslav embassy in search of asylum, he was later arrested by Soviet authorities, and like hundreds of other prominent revolutionaries, Nagy was summarily executed after a mock show trial. During the weeks that followed, 200,000 Hungarians fled the country, while thousands more were arrested and sent to labor camps. Over 2,500 Hungarians and 700 Soviet troops were killed during the uprising, forcing a repressed population back into obedient silence until the Soviet Union dissolved in December of 1991. And there you have it, the Hungarian Uprising of 1956. Today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. After years of economic decline and a rising awareness by average Joe Russians that the Soviet political elites ate caviar in their dakas, while average Joe stood hungry in food lines, the Soviet Union's ironclad grip over her citizens began to crumble by the late 1980s. Fully aware of the failing state of the Soviet economy, in 1985, General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev began to usher in reforms that would move his nation from strict Marxist-Leninist communism to social democracy. Sensing change in the Soviets' core ideology after 40 years of budget-draining Cold War, U.S. President Ronald Reagan called out Gorbachev during a 1987 speech near the Berlin Wall that divided communist East Berlin from democratic West Berlin.
Behind me stands a wall that encircles the free sectors of this city, part of a vast system of barriers that divides the entire continent of Europe. General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
2 years later, on the 9th of November 1987, East German politician Günter Schabowski inadvertently triggered the fall of the Berlin Wall when at a live press conference he read a draft bill just passed by the East German government which eased restrictions on the rights of citizens to immigrate to the West. When asked by reporters when these more lenient measures would take effect, Schabowski answered immediately. Known by Germans as Der Mauer, when the news broke, people amassed on both sides of the Berlin Wall, celebrating the end of their divided city for the first time in 26 years. Early breach attempts to the wall met with only mild resistance from border guards, which ushered in a full reunion as people freely crossed through Checkpoint Charlie. The following morning, after Berliners had chipped away at the wall for souvenirs, the wall came down in earnest when excavators were brought in to officially bring the wall to its highly anticipated end. And there you have it, Ronald Reagan's landmark speech, today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, Chernobyl suffers a catastrophic meltdown. In 1986, the first word that something was seriously wrong came from a power plant in eastern Sweden when workers coming on the job registered abnormally high levels of radiation on their bodies. Although the levels were not high enough to harm humans, the plant was shut down as a precaution until authorities could get a handle on the source. In a cascading domino aftermath, similar reports of high radiation began pouring in from all over Scandinavia, leading to the conclusion that the problem lay elsewhere, to the east in the Soviet Union. When media containment was no longer possible, Soviet officials belatedly confirmed that a catastrophic nuclear meltdown had occurred in the number 4 reactor at Chernobyl, not far from the Ukrainian city of Kiev. Denmark reported a 5 times increase in radiation levels, while Finland clocked in at 6. Radiation levels in Norway rose 50%, while Sweden's levels rose into the illegal category. The accident began during an electrical power outage safety test on Chernobyl's number 4 reactor, designed to ensure that interim water circulation measures could sufficiently cool the reactor's core until backup electrical generators could be brought online. During the planned shutdown, power levels unexpectedly dropped to 0, which combined with reactor design flaws, lack of operating protocols, and worker fatigue to set off an uncontrolled nuclear chain reaction or meltdown. The subsequent steam explosion and reactor core fire released a deadly yet invisible plume of radioactive fallout, 70% of which fell on nearby Belarus. A 6-mile exclusion zone was created 36 hours after the accident, forcing nearly 50,000 people to be evacuated from the nearby city of Pripyat. Shortly thereafter, the exclusion radius was further expanded to 19 miles, forcing an additional 68,000 people to be relocated elsewhere in the Soviet Union. By the end of 1986, a sarcophagus had been built around the exploded reactor, involving 500,000 at-risk workers at an estimated cost of $68 billion in today's currency. The radiation fallout contaminated water supplies, agricultural lands, and animal herd stocks throughout Belarus and Scandinavia, forcing farmers to fallow crops for several years to come. Cancer rates rose precipitously in the affected areas, pinning some medical estimates regarding resultant cancer deaths at 16,000 innocent lives. And there you have it. Chernobyl suffers a catastrophic meltdown. Today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, mask slackers and the Spanish flu of 1918. While the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 extracted a far greater mortality than the coronavirus pandemic of 2020, an estimated 50 to 100 million lives worldwide, health officials in 1918 grappled with the same mass slacker behaviors widely experienced in 2020. Much like COVID lockdowns, the Spanish flu saw the same closures of schools, businesses, and theaters, while public health officials encouraged people to cough or sneeze into a handkerchief, a practice that didn't completely catch on until after the pandemic was over. In Philadelphia, streetcar signs warned that spitting spread death, while the New York City Health Department even advised people not to kiss except through a handkerchief. In Western states, some cities adopted mandatory mask ordinances, posing the argument that wearing one was a patriotic duty. In October of 1918, the San Francisco Chronicle ran a public service announcement which said that the man or woman or child who will not wear a mask now is a dangerous slacker, which was a direct reference to the type of World War I slacker who refused to fight or help out in the war effort. One sign in California went so far as to threaten jail time for any and all mask slackers who refused to comply. For the most part, Americans in the western United States complied with the original mask order, but when a second spike in cases hit in January 1919, leading San Francisco officials to implement a second masking order, the mandate was met with increasing resistance. At the behest of the Surgeon General's office, newspapers around the country published a cartoon of a man hacking in public that warned, "Coughs and sneezes spread diseases as dangerous as poison gas shells," another direct reference between fighting the flu and fighting the First World War. The value of fresh air through open windows cannot be overemphasized, Surgeon General Rupert Blue wrote to the American people. When crowding is unavoidable, as in streetcars, care should be taken to keep the face so turned as to not inhale directly the air breathed out by another person. Today, while pandemics are far from new to humanity, the one certainty, it appears, is that human behavior, both then and now, is the primary vector that guarantees the spread of a newly arrived pathogen into a worldwide health disaster. And there you have it, mask slackers and the Spanish flu of 1918. Today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, the Imperial Japanese Navy bombs America. On September 9, 1942, submarine I-25 of the Imperial Japanese Navy surfaced 33 miles off the coast of Oregon, directly abeam of the Cape Blanco lighthouse. As his seaplane was being unpacked and assembled from its hold in front of the conning tower, pilot Nobuo Fuchida placed a strand of his hair into a small wooden box. "If I were to die and my body could not be recovered," he recalled after the war, "these remains would be sent back to my wife." When his plane was assembled and on its catapult, Fujita tucked his 400-year-old family samurai sword against the inner sidewall of his cockpit, a tradition he began in flight school. While Fujita would rather have dropped his ordnance on nearby Fort Stevens, his orders were to drop his incendiary bombs into dense Oregon forest, causing an anticipated runaway fire near the small lumbering town of Brookings. With 520 thermite pellets housed in each of his two bombs, Japanese war planners hoped that the resultant 2,700-degree heat from the twin detonations would match the September 1936 fire that destroyed 287,000 acres of Oregon forest, while burning the coastal town of Bandon to the ground. The tactic was also intended to scare the Americans, forcing the U.S. Navy to divert war assets away from the Solomon Islands in defense of the western United States. After catapulting from the submarine's midget flight deck and flying a good ways inland near Mount Emily, Fujita ordered his weapons officer, Soichi Okuda, to drop the first bomb, followed by a second release a mile or so away. The detonations caused multiple clusters of fires, but thanks to the watchful eye of forest fire spotters and a godsend blanket of rain, The fires were quickly extinguished by the combined hand of man and Mother Nature. 20 years after the war, a group of JCs from the Junior Chamber of Commerce in Brookings, Oregon, invited Fujita and his wife to visit, where Fujita made history as the first and last Japanese fighter to reach American soil. And on May 24, 1962, after Oregon Governor Mark Hatfield and President John F. Kennedy approved the goodwill visit, Fujita and his wife Ayako closed another chapter from one of the bloodiest periods in world history. And there you have it. Nobuo Fujita bombs America. Today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, the air traffic controller strike of 1981. Since its formation in 1968, PATCO, or the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization, had a long history of sick-out protests against the rigid edicts placed upon them by the controller's employer, the Federal Aviation Administration, or FAA. The sick-outs caused major delays at airports across the United States and abroad, yet by existing federal law, the government union was unable to strike. While PATCO had endorsed Democratic Party candidates since its inception, in 1980, the union refused to back President Jimmy Carter due to ongoing poor labor relations with the FAA, instead backing GOP presidential candidate Ronald Reagan. When contract negotiations began in February of 1981 between PATCO and the FAA, citing safety concerns, PATCO called for a reduced 32-hour work week, a $10,000 pay increase, and a better retirement package than the one they currently enjoyed. When the FAA refused to budge on a shortened work week, at 7 a.m. on August 3, 1981, the union declared a strike. Despite supporting Reagan in 1980, Reagan declared the striking federal workers a peril to national safety, ordering them back to work under the terms of the Taft-Hartley Act. With only 1,300 of the nearly 13,000 controllers responding to Reagan's order, on August 5th, 2 days after the strike began, the president fired 11,345 striking federal controllers.
Let me read the solemn oath taken by each of these employees in the sworn affidavit when they accepted their jobs. I am not participating in any strike against the government of the United States or any agency thereof, and I will not so participate while an employee of the government of the United States or any agency thereof. It is for this reason that I must tell those who fail to report for duty this morning they are in violation of the law, and if they do not report for work within 48 hours, they have forfeited their jobs and will be terminated. End of statement.
The mass firings left a huge shortage of certified controllers, forcing airlines to dramatically cut back on the number of flights the system could handle, further prompting the FAA to move supervisors and military controllers into control towers across the nation. While the FAA initially claimed that staffing levels would be restored within 2 years, in reality, it took 10 before pre-strike staffing levels were finally achieved. And there you have it, the PATCO strike of 1981. Today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, direct dial telephone service goes nationwide. For anyone born after the baby boom generation, any memory or knowledge about rotary dial landline telephones is most likely limited to old movies or the occasional sighting of such an arcane device in a museum or exhibition. At the time of its first introduction, however, the advent of the rotary dial telephone was considered by most Americans in the 1950s as a giant leap forward in American technology and ingenuity. Up until late 1951, to make a phone call out of your home or office required an operator who would physically connect your call by temporary cable connections on a switchboard, which meant that total call volume for a given town was limited to the size and number of switchboards and operators in use. Truly private calls were out of the question, since American families generally had only one telephone per household stationed in a common area, And there was always the possibility that a nosy operator was listening in on your call. That all began to change when on November 10, 1951, Englewood, New Jersey Mayor M. Leslie Denning used a rotary phone to dial a just-introduced 3-digit area code, followed by a 7-digit number for Mayor Frank Osborne's office in Alameda, California. 18 seconds later, the two mayors were talking to each other without the intercession of an operator or a switchboard. Today, now that smartphones and 5G wireless rule the airways, many communications analysts believe that the landline telephone will soon follow the rotary dial phone into landfills near you. Today on the Daily Dose, the Japanese holdouts of World War II. Of the more than 6 million men who fought in the Imperial Japanese Army during World War II, given the remote nature of many South Pacific battlefields, some soldiers failed to get the memo that the war had ended on August 15, 1945. Japanese holdouts either doubted the veracity of the formal surrender of Japan or simply failed to receive any form of communication that their war against the Allies had been lost. For instance, on January 1, 1946, 20 Japanese soldiers hiding in a tunnel on Corregidor Island surrendered to U.S. servicemen after learning the war had ended from a newspaper they found while collecting fresh water. In late March of 1947, Lieutenant Ai Yamaguchi and his corps of 33 soldiers emerged on Peleliu to attack a U.S. Marine Corps detachment stationed on the island, believing the war was still underway. Reinforcements were sent in, along with a Japanese admiral who was able to convince the men that the war was finally over. Notable holdouts continued to surrender into the 1950s and 60s, including Private Bunzo Minagawa, who held out on Guam until May 1960, and Sergeant Masashi Ito, Minagawa's superior, who surrendered days later on May 23, 1960, almost 15 years after Japan's formal surrender. Miraculously, some Japanese servicemen continued the fight into the 1970s, including Sergeant Shoichi Yoko, who served under Masashi Ito when he was finally captured on Guam. In October of 1972, Private First Class Kenichi Kozuka held out with Lieutenant Onoda for 28 years, until he was killed in a shootout with Philippine police. In March of 1974, a full 29 years after the end of the war, Lieutenant Hiro Onoda surrendered on Lubang after holding out on the island since December of 1944, refusing to surrender until he was relieved of duty by his former commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, who had flown to Lubang to formally relieve Onoda. And last but not least, Private Teru Nagamura was discovered by the Indonesian Air Force on Morotai, surrendering to a search party on December 18, 1974, a full 29 years, 3 months, and 16 days after the Japanese instrument of surrender was signed. Now that's a committed patriot. And there you have it, the Japanese holdouts of World War II, today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, the life and works of Thomas Paine. Historian Saul K. Padover described Thomas Paine as a corset maker by trade, a journalist by profession, and a propagandist by inclination, which quite adequately sums up the life and work of a man deeply ensconced in political activism and the Enlightenment-era ideals of transnational human rights. Born in Thetford, England in 1736, Thomas Paine migrated to the American colonies at the age of 38 with the help of Benjamin Franklin, arriving just in time to fuel the fires of the American Revolution. Almost every colonialist rebel read or listened to his powerful dissertation entitled Common Sense, which was by far the best-selling pamphlet in all of the colonies. Common Sense was so influential to the American Revolution that John Adams said of the work, "Without the pen of the author of Common Sense, the sword of Washington would have been raised in vain. Paine's next successful work was a series of pamphlets known collectively as the American Crisis, which further inflamed pro-revolutionary sentiment in the colonies. After successfully assisting independence in America, Paine moved to France for most of the 1790s, where he became a leading proponent in the French Revolution. After penning The Rights of Man in 1791, in defense of the French Revolution against its critics, his attacks on Anglo-Irish conservative writer Edmund Burke led to a trial and conviction in absentia in England for the crime of seditious libel. Worried by the possibility that the French Revolution might well spread into England, the British government of William Pitt the Younger attempted to suppress Paine's philosophies, which advocated the right of citizens to overthrow their governments. In 1792, England issued a writ for his arrest, which forced Paine to flee to France permanently in September of that same year. Despite his inability to speak the French language, he was quickly elected to the French National Convention. Deemed an enemy of France by the ruling authorities in the country, the Montagnard, led by Maximilien Robespierre, in December of 1793, Paine was arrested and taken to Luxembourg prison in Paris, where he continued to write The Age of Reason, which challenged institutionalized Christian dogma and the legitimacy of the Bible. After future U.S. President James Monroe used his diplomatic connections to secure Paine's release from prison, Paine published Agrarian Justice in 1797, which challenged the origins and legitimacy of property rights and introduced the concept of a guaranteed minimum income through a one-time inheritance tax on landowners. He returned to the U.S. in 1802, and upon his death 7 years later, only 6 people attended his funeral due to his staunch ridicule of the Christian faith. And there you have it, the life and works of Thomas Paine, today on A Daily Dose. Today on The Daily Dose, World War I mustard gas joins the fight against cancer. When the Germans introduced the horrors of chemical warfare to the battlefields of the First World War, one of their favorite go-to agents was the devastating sulfur-based cytotoxic chemical known as mustard gas. Although banned by the Geneva Protocol of 1925, the outbreak of World War II caused concerns from the Allied nations that Germany would yet again revert to chemical weapons. The Allies' concerns led to further study, which discovered that mustard gas, or nitrogen mustard, appeared to be an effective treatment against cancer. As a result, 2 pharmacologists from the Yale School of Medicine were commissioned by the U.S. Department of Defense to investigate potential therapeutic applications of chemical warfare agents. Louis Goodman and Alfred Gilman observed that mustard gas was too volatile an agent to be suitable for laboratory experiments, but when they exchanged a nitrogen molecule for sulfur, they discovered a more stable compound in nitrogen mustard. A year into the start of their research, a German air attack at the Americans' 15th Air Force supply port of Bari, Italy, led to the exposure and death of 1,000 port workers, when a secret cargo of mustard gas bombs released their deadly contents when they exploded on the SS John Harvey. Dr. Stuart Francis Alexander, an expert on chemical warfare, was subsequently deployed to investigate the aftermath, and upon autopsy of the victims, he discovered that a profound lymphoid and myeloid suppression had occurred after exposure to mustard gas. After their initial anti-cancer discovery, Goodman and Gilman set up an experimental animal model where they established lymphomas in mice, treating the cancers effectively with mustard agents. Next, in collaboration with thoracic surgeon Gustav Lindskog, they injected mustine, the first prototype nitrogen mustard chemotherapy agent, into a patient with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, observing a profound reduction in the patient's tumor masses. After the first clinical trials for the newly discovered chemotherapy agent was reported in 1946, chemotherapy has become one of the primary cancer treatment options throughout the modern world. And there you have it. World War I mustard gas joins the fight against cancer. Today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, a big week for the Allied air war in Europe. When military aviation came of age during the interwar years between World War I and World War II, a group of air war leaders and strategists known as the Bomber Mafia developed bombardment tactics and aircraft that would forever change the face of warfare. Before any planned considerations for an invasion of northern France could be considered, the Luftwaffe, or German Air Force, had to be destroyed, both in the air and on the ground. All parties agreed that Operation Overlord, as the D-Day invasion had been codenamed, would suffer an egregious loss of life should the Luftwaffe maintain its ability to strafe Allied combatants as they made their way ashore. As a result, Allied air war leaders stuck it to the Nazis during Operation Argument, or what has commonly become known as Big Week. With the arrival of the P-51 Mustang into the skies over Europe, long-range heavy bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator now enjoyed fighter protection all the way to and beyond the IP, or initial point, which is the point in a mission when bomb groups tighten their formations to better defend against German fighter attacks. During Big Week missions flown from February 20th through the 25th, 1944, 8th Air Force Commander General Jimmy Doolittle overcame Germany's reluctance to engage Allied fighters by attacking key aircraft factories that the Luftwaffe could not afford to lose. In addition, Allied fighters were ordered to abandon the bombers with the primary goal of shooting down enemy fighters. In effect, the primary purpose of the bombing missions was to bring up the Luftwaffe, while the real role of the Allied bombers was to be used and sacrificed as bait. During Big Week, the Americans flew missions against airframe and assembly plants over numerous German cities, including Regensburg, Schweinfurt, and Steyr, dropping roughly 10,000 tons of bombs. The 8th Air Force, flying out of England, delivered 3,000 sorties at a loss of 97 Fortresses and 40 Liberators, with another 20 heavy bombers scrapped due to damage. Each downed aircraft would cost the Allies 10 to 11 men. The much smaller yet still forming 15th Air Force, flying out of 21 air bases in southeastern Italy, would fly 500 sorties, losing 90 heavy bombers, while the British RAF Bomber Command lost 131 bombers during their nightly raids over Germany. While the number of U.S. aircrew kills on German fighters is most likely wildly exaggerated in the heat of battle, nearly 500 reported kills, Big Week was considered a significant contributor to the Allies' official pronouncement of air superiority over the Luftwaffe in March of 1944. And there you have it, a big week for the Allied air war in Europe. Today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, Albert Schatz, the biggest loser in scientific discovery. After Alexander Fleming's discovery of penicillin in 1928, the world of science and medicine still had no defense against gram-negative bacterias, responsible for the likes of tuberculosis, bubonic plague, cholera, typhoid fever, and other penicillin-resistant diseases. Albert Schatz ended that deficiency in 1943, working as a postgraduate assistant under the supervision of Selman Waxman, who led the soil microbiology department at Rutgers College of Agriculture. In search of a gram-negative antibiotic, Schatz followed a hunch that became the most important microbiological breakthrough of the 20th century. After Schatz discovered the first 2 strains of the gram-negative antibiotic streptomycin, Waxman immediately saw the potential of Schatz's discovery. He took full control of all clinical trials, making the 23-year-old understudy sign an agreement which ceded all patent and royalty rights to Rutgers. Waxman would go on to take full credit for the discovery of streptomycin, as well as a Nobel Prize in 1952. never once in his life accrediting Schatz as the true source of the breakthrough. When Schatz discovered that Waxman was receiving a royalty for streptomycin to the tune of $3.8 million in today's money, Schatz sued Waxman and Rutgers and won an out-of-court settlement for $120,000 and 3% of the royalties for several years to follow. But the move ruined his career in academia, forcing him to accept teaching roles in a small agriculture college in Pennsylvania. His papers were routinely rejected by leading science journals, and when he wrote his account of what really happened regarding the discovery of streptomycin, the only journal willing to publish his account was the Pakistan Dental Review. 20 years after Waxman's death, the American Society for Microbiology invited Schatz to address their annual meeting on the 50th anniversary of streptomycin's discovery, ironically bestowing him with the Society's highest honor, the Selman A. Waxman Medal. Life sometimes can be enormously unfair. And there you have it, Albert Schatz, the biggest loser in scientific discovery, today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, the TMC Dumont, a study in form, function, and design. Looking like something ripped out of a science fiction movie, retired Formula One driver Tarso Marquis has created an incredibly sleek and low-profile motorcycle that sports an airplane engine with silver hubless wheels. Tarso's creation includes a 300-horsepower, 6-cylinder Rolls-Royce Continental engine, widely used in aviation during the 1960s. While the engine draws the immediate attention of motorcycle enthusiasts, the wheels catch the attention of anyone who sees this most inventful of machines. Two massive 36-inch silver hubless wheels appear to be magically attached to the bike, giving the TMC Dumont an incredibly futuristic appearance. Adding to the outstanding performance of this machine of tomorrow is the bike's continuously variable transmission, or CVT, a transmission designed, developed, and manufactured uniquely for the Dumont. The CVT has no clutch or manual gear shifting, allowing the driver to simply roll the throttle to engage the bike, much like the operation of a scooter. The name Dumont is a tribute to Alberto Santos Dumont, who was a national hero in Brazil and believed by many Brazilians to have beaten the Wright brothers' historic 1903 flight at Kitty Hawk. How the bike drives on the street is a bit of a technological wonder, employing pivot points on the front suspension, which helps the rider navigate the bike through turns. While Tarso had conceived and continuously refined the Dumont for the preceding 15 years, the TMC Dumont made its debut at Daytona Bike Week 2018, where the futuristic machine won Best in Show over hundreds of competing motorcycles. And there you have it. Form, function, and design marry up in the TMC Dumont. Today in the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, Louis Zamperini survives the unimaginable. Born in 1917, Louis Zamperini was a tough kid out of Torrance, California. A smoker by age 5, Louis was always getting into fights, while his favorite trick was stealing beer from bootleggers. When the chief of police and his high school principal tried to redirect the misguided youth into track and field after a shaky start due to his long history of smoking, in 1934, Louis broke the world interscholastic mile record of 4 minutes 21 seconds, a record that would stand for the next 2 decades. Soon afterwards, the Torrance Tornado, as he was nicknamed, qualified for the 1936 Olympic Games, taking 8th place in the 5,000-meter race, but only after he ran the last quarter mile in just 56 seconds. The feat prompted a face-to-face meeting with Adolf Hitler, just 3 years before Nazi troops would blitzkrieg their way into Poland. After war broke out, Louis left USC and joined the Army Air Corps in the Pacific Theater, earning the nickname Lucky Louie after cheating death multiple times as a bombardier until his luck ran out on May 27, 1943. On a search and rescue mission 800 miles from land, his B-24 went down at sea, killing 8 crew members but sparing Louis, the pilot Russell Phillips, and tail gunner Francis McNamara. The survivors floated in a life raft for 27 days, surviving on albatross meat and small fish, including the livers of small sharks they caught by hand. On the 27th day at sea, their luck turned south yet again, when they were spotted by Japanese fighters. The 3 men were strafed in a 30-minute assault, but thinking the castaways were dead, the Japanese finally left them alone. Miraculously, all 3 men had made it through the attack without a scratch. 6 days later, McNamara passed away on their 33rd day adrift, and as bad luck would have it, on their 47th day, having drifted some 2,000 miles to the Marshall Islands, they were made prisoners of war by the Japanese. Louis weighed just 65 pounds, and after being transferred to Execution Island, so named because most prisoners of war that were taken there were executed by decapitation with a samurai sword, Louis and other Allied prisoners were abused daily and kept on a starvation diet. On 3 occasions, Louis was subjected to medical experiments, but after 47 days on Execution Island, Louis was transferred to a prisoner of war camp, where he and others were horribly tortured by Mutsuhiro Watanabe, aka the Bird, an experience so horrifying that Louis still could not bring himself to talk about his experiences, even 50 years after the war. After the Japanese tried to use his Olympic fame in a propaganda radio broadcast, Louis refused and was reassigned to a labor camp. Out of spite, the Japanese transferred the Bird to Louis's camp, where the torture would begin anew. Freed at war's end, Louis married a Miami socialite and began drinking heavily as a way to chase the Bird and his memories of torture from his mind. With his marriage on the rocks, after his wife converted to Christ, Louis followed his wife's lead and converted as well.
I made my confession of faith in Christ. I knew I'd forgiven them. I knew it. I knew I was through getting drunk, I was through smoking, and I had a whole new life now.
And there you have it. The Torrance tornado survives the unimaginable. Today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose. A bad day for rock and roll at the Altamont Music Festival. After the 3-day music festival at Woodstock, Rolling Stones lead singer Mick Jagger began obsessing about a similar music event in San Francisco, including a film documentary of the event, soon nicknamed Woodstock West.
We are doing a free concert in San Francisco on December 6th.
Knowing the city lacked the infrastructure for such a mass invasion of stoned-out concert-goers, San Francisco officials quickly shut down the notion, forcing the Stones to sign a financially bad deal to host the event at Sears Point Raceway in Sonoma. Pulling out of the deal just 2 days before the previously announced event, roadies moved the stage and sound system 80 miles southeast to Altamont Speedway near Livermore, California. Due to Jagger's long-standing dislike of police, at the behest of the Grateful Dead, the Stones hired the Hells Angels motorcycle gang for concert ground security, paying them $500 in beer to cover the event. When the concert kicked off on December 6, 1969, to an overcapacity crowd of more than 300,000 people, the Angels turned violent almost the moment they arrived, beating back concertgoers with sawed-off pool cues, metal pipes, and motorcycle chains. To make matters worse, a batch of bad acid had circulated widely throughout the concert grounds, increasing conflicts between stoners and the openly violent Hells Angels. The concert included sets by Santana, Jefferson Airplane, the Flying Burrito Brothers, Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, the Grateful Dead, and the Rolling Stones. Although the Dead backed out after the Angels' unmitigated violence became amplified under the worsening effects of alcohol and drugs. Even the lead singer of Jefferson Airplane, Marty Balin, was knocked unconscious when he tried to stop fights from breaking out between the Angels and concert-goers pressing in on the stage.
Hey man, I'd like to mention that the Hells Angels just smashed Marty Balin in the face and knocked him out for a bit. I'd like to thank you for that.
Having already been involved in a fight with the Angels, when the Stones took the stage after dark, teenager Meredith Hunter tried to scale a speaker cabinet for a better view of the band's rendition of Under My Thumb. When he was quickly knocked off the cabinet by Hell's Angels, Hunter drew a gun and threatened his aggressors, prompting Angel Alan Passero to draw a knife and stab the teen no less than 4 times. Hunter died at the scene, and while Passero was put on trial for first-degree murder, after footage surfaced of Hunter drawing his gun, Passero was acquitted on grounds of self-defense. And there you have it. A bad day for rock and roll at the Altamont Music Festival. Today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, Hitler's Olympic Games. For 2 weeks in August 1936, athletes descended upon Berlin for the 11th Olympic Games. Visitors and athletes alike were warmly welcomed, but behind the pomp and pageantry were ominous signs of a Nazi regime gone bad. The swastika was openly displayed on banners around town and at the Olympic Stadium, while the German sense of Aryan supremacy was a hard thing to conceal. After the aggressions displayed by the Germans during World War I, Hitler and his propaganda machine used the Olympics as a way to present a kinder, gentler image to a largely skeptical world. Off the field, the truth about what the Nazis were up to was hard for foreigners to miss. By 1936, Jews and other minorities had been openly stripped of their civil rights and even their citizenship, while Jewish-owned businesses were forced to display the Star of David on their storefronts. History would later reveal that the Nazis had already opened their first concentration camp by the time the Games began. Prior to the start of the Games, debate raged in the U.S. and other participating countries about whether to attend at all. But in the end, 49 nations, including the United States, came to Germany to compete. And at the opening ceremonies, visiting athletes and spectators alike witnessed Aryan athletes follow in the footsteps of ancient Greeks, bringing fire from Mount Olympus in the first ever Olympic torch relay. Popular history remembers Jesse Owens' 4 gold medals, an Olympic first for any athlete, no doubt causing great embarrassment to the Germans' belief in their Aryan supremacy. The Games also stood as a major corruption to the ideals sacred to the Olympic Games, creating an illusion of a peaceful and tolerant nation that was the farthest thing from the truth. 3 years later, Nazi stormtroopers would blitzkrieg into Poland, setting off 6 years of war that would cost the lives of 60 million people. And there you have it, Hitler's Olympic Games, today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, Catherine the Great. Born Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst on May 2, 1729, Catherine the Great was Empress of Russia from 1762 until her death in 1796, giving her the distinction as Russia's longest ruling female leader. Coming to power following a coup d'etat that overthrew her husband, Tsar Peter III, under her reign, Russia grew from near third world obscurity to one of the greatest powers in all of Europe. Proving the age-old adage that an angry wife can be detrimental to a husband's health, Catherine's marriage to Tsar Peter III proved to be a raging disaster from the start. When Catherine became pregnant with her second child, Anna, due to various rumors of Catherine's promiscuity, Peter rejected his biological connection to the child, proclaiming that Anna should go to the devil. Catherine wrote in her diary that I used to say to myself that happiness and misery depend on ourselves, and to improve her sense of happiness, she conspired with other political opponents to Tsar Peter, leading to his assassination on July the 8th, 1762. While his assassins remain unclear, after an autopsy, Peter's official cause of death was labeled a severe attack of hemorrhoidal colic and an apoplexy stroke. Once in power, Catherine aligned herself with noble strongmen and generals alike, rapidly expanding the Russian Empire by conquest and diplomacy. In the south, the Crimean Khaganate was crushed following victories over the Ottoman Empire in the Russo-Turkish Wars, followed by the colonization of the Novorossiya territories along the coast of the Black and Azov Seas. A great admirer of the Enlightenment and Peter the Great, Catherine continued to modernize Russia along Western European standards, including the foundation of the Smolny Institute for Noble Maidens, the first state-funded university-level institution for women in Europe, as well as the Moscow Orphanage for Disadvantaged Children and the Bolshoi Theater. She also established the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, Russia, sending out Soviets or art collectors to acquire famous works of art throughout Europe and the world. Today, the Hermitage represents the second largest art museum in the world, which celebrates its founding each year on December 7th, with ceremonies known as St. Catherine's Day. And there you have it, Catherine the Great, today in the Daily Dose. If you like learning something new every day, subscribe to the Daily Dose on YouTube or sign up for emails at dailydosenow.com. Today in the Daily Dose, Andrew Carnegie, the story of a self-made man. Born in 1835 Dunfermline, Scotland, Andrew Carnegie was the son of an impoverished weaver family who emigrated to western Pennsylvania in 1848 in search of a better life. At the tender age of 12, Andrew displayed his budding work ethic by taking a job as a bobbin boy, working 12 hours a day, 6 days a week for the Anchor Cotton Mills Company, earning the staggering wage of $1.20 a week, or $35 in today's currency. In 1849, after becoming an accomplished telegraph operator, Andrew's budding passion for education and reading was given a boost by Colonel James Anderson, who gave the young lad access to his personal library of over 400 volumes of books. The young prodigy was so grateful for the colonel's generosity, obliging Carnegie to make a personal resolution that if his future endeavors ever made him a rich man, he would give back to society so that other poor boys could follow in his footsteps as a self-made man. By the age of 24, Carnegie landed a job as the superintendent of the Western Division of the Pennsylvania Railroad, which gave him the financial wherewithal to invest in growing companies. In 1864, Carnegie was one of the early investors in the Columbia Oil Company, which yielded over $1 million in cash dividends in 1 year alone. The demand for iron weapons during the Civil War led Carnegie into the steel industry, which elevated him to industrialist stature by 1885. One of his two great innovations as a steel magnate was the adoption of the Bessemer process, which allowed the high carbon content of lesser-grade pig iron to be forged into high-grade steel. As a result of his innovation, steel prices plummeted, making his Bessemer steel the go-to source for the construction of rail lines, skyscrapers, and bridges. As a result, Carnegie Steel became the largest producer of steel in America, outputting more than 2,000 tons of high-grade steel per day. After selling Carnegie Steel to J.P. Morgan in 1901 for a whopping $304 million, Andrew Carnegie dedicated the last 18 years of his life to philanthropy, giving away over 90% of his wealth. With a net worth pegged at nearly $70 billion in today's currency, his contributions include Carnegie Hall in New York City and the Peace Palace or International Court of Justice in The Hague. He also founded the Carnegie Corporation of New York, which supported educational causes in the U.S. and later the world, as well as the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace the Carnegie Institution for Science, and the Carnegie Trust for the Universities of Scotland. He also created the Carnegie Hero Fund, which provided financial assistance and recognition for Americans and Canadians who had performed extraordinary acts of heroism in civilian life, while also founding Carnegie Mellon University and the Carnegie Museums of Pittsburgh. And there you have it, Andrew Carnegie, a self-made man of the Gilded Age, today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, the prophecies of Nostradamus. While most academics dismiss the prophecies of Nostradamus as intentional mistranslations of his 1555 publication of Les Prophéties, others have found his prophecies regarding future events to be numbingly close to the truth. A physician and astrologer by trade, his book of 942 poetic quatrains has long captivated the world. For instance, one of his prophecies regarding 9/11 reads, "Earth-shaking fire from the center of the earth shall cause tremors around the new city. Two great rocks will war for a long time. Then Arethusa will redden a new river." Another of his poems relating to 9/11 reads, "Two steel birds shall fall from the sky on the metropolis. The sky will burn at 40 degrees latitude," which in truth turns out to be the exact latitude for New York City. Among Nostradamus' most talked about prophecies include the Great London Fire of 1666, the French Revolution, the rise of both Napoleon Bonaparte and later Adolf Hitler, the Apollo moon landings, and the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster. He also prophesied the death of Diana, Princess of Wales, both World War I and World War II, and the nuclear destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. While academics insist that the prophecies of Nostradamus are little more than retroactive clairvoyant interpretations of his quatrains, plenty others maintain that Nostradamus was and remains one of the most gifted seers of all time. And there you have it, the prophecies of Nostradamus, today on the Daily Dose. If you like learning something new every day, subscribe to the Daily Dose on YouTube or sign up for emails at dailydosenow.com. Today on the Daily Dose, the Erie Canal. First proposed in the 1780s and then reproposed in 1807, a survey was authorized, funded, and executed in 1808, despite heavy opposition to the crazy notion of building a 363-mile man-made waterway connecting the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean. Nicknamed Clinton's Folly or Clinton's Big Ditch, New York Governor DeWitt Clinton's 10-year dogged campaign to build such a waterway finally overcame his opponents, including Presidents Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who both considered the project preposterous. For a nation just 41 years old, when digging finally began in 1817, the construction of the Erie Canal proved to be the first monumental feat in early large-scale American engineering, an event which ushered in the industrial age in America. Dug entirely by hand, the Erie Canal includes 34 numbered locks beginning at Black Rock Lock and ending downstream at Troy Federal Lock, for a total elevation difference of 565 feet. Clocking in at 40 feet wide and 4 feet deep, the Erie Canal was largely built by Irish immigrants who worked 14-hour days and earned 80 cents a day in some of the most hazardous working conditions the nation's labor pool faced at the time. The construction would go on for 8 years, and despite the long time span, the project would be completed on time, in advance, and under budget. Bands played and cannons boomed when Clinton opened the canal in 1825, and he was soon vindicated when the Erie Canal became an immediate success. Goods and people were able to travel faster and easier, dropping drayage costs by as much as 95%. The tolls collected soon paid the state of New York back for the canal's $7 million construction cost, proving DeWitt's skeptics flat out wrong in a matter of months. The Erie Canal's peak year was 1855, when some 33,000 commercial passages took place, although since that high water time period, commercial traffic continued a yearly and steady decline, finally coming to an end in 1994, when the last commercial ship Day Peckinpah was officially retired. Today, the Erie Canal is mostly enjoyed by recreational watercraft, yet its vital role in the robust economic development of the eastern and midwestern regions of the United States is forever cemented in the annals of American history. And there you have it, the Erie Canal, today in the Daily Dose. If you like learning something new every day, subscribe to the Daily Dose on YouTube or sign up for emails at dailydosenow.com. Today in the Daily Dose, the Yalta Conference and the fate of post-war Europe. Known as the Crimea Conference, or more popularly the Yalta Conference, the big three Allied leaders came together at a palace in the Black Sea resort town of Yalta to determine the post-war fate of Europe. Arriving on the 4th of February, 1945, and lasting for the next 7 days, U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin met at Levadia Palace to shape a post-war peace that represented not just a collective security order, but a plan to give self-determination to the liberated peoples of post-Nazi occupied Europe. Marking the third wartime meeting between the Big Three, by the time of the Yalta Conference, the Allies had liberated all of France and Belgium, with fighting now closing in on the western border of Germany, while in the east, Soviet forces were less than 40 miles from Berlin, having already pushed the Germans out of Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria. During the talks, Stalin agreed to enter the Pacific War against Japan within 3 months after the fall of Germany, and since the Russians had suffered egregious losses to German aggression in both world wars, the group agreed that Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria, the historical corridors for forces attempting to invade Russia, would remain in the Soviet sphere as a security buffer for a war-weary Soviet nation. The conference further set the boundaries for post-war occupation zones in Germany, including one for each 3 principal Allied nations attending the conference, along with a 4th zone for France, whose leader Charles de Gaulle was snubbed from the meeting, a diplomatic slight that caused a deep and lasting resentment in the French leader. Despite the fact that Berlin resided in the Soviet zone, the city was further divided into 4 zones of occupation, again by the principal Allied nations. A declaration of liberated Europe was also created by the Big Three, which encouraged the people of Europe to create democratic institutions of their own design and to hold free elections for governments responsive to the will of the people. And there you have it, the Yalta Conference and the fate of post-war Europe, today on the Daily Dose. If you like learning something new every day, subscribe to the Daily Dose on YouTube or sign up for emails at dailydosenow.com. Today on the Daily Dose, the Opium Wars. In earlier times, opium was perceived in China as a relatively harmless medicine, but a new practice arose in the 18th century of smoking opium recreationally, which vastly increased demand while leading to the widespread addiction of the Chinese population. In an attempt to curb the growing problem, Chinese Qing dynasty emperors drafted a succession of laws from 1729 to 1831, which made the drug illegal, yet imports continued to grow as smugglers and corrupt officials gorged on massive profits. Before the First Opium War, China enjoyed a favorable trade balance with Europe, selling porcelains, silk, and tea in exchange for silver. In the late 18th century, however, the British East India Company expanded cultivation of opium in its Indian Bengal territory, selling it to private traders who transported it into China and passed it on to Chinese smugglers. By 1787, the company was sending 4,000 chests of the drug annually into China, each containing 170 pounds of opium, creating a nation of addicts which the Qing dynasty sought to eradicate. By 1833, opium trafficking into China had soared to 30,000 chests a year. As a result, 2 wars waged between the Qing dynasty and the Western powers using the Chinese populace as a profit generator. The First Opium War was fought from 1839 to 1842 between the Qing dynasty and Great Britain, while the second was fought between the Qing dynasty, Great Britain, France, and Russia from 1856 to 1860. In each war, European soldiers and naval assets employed superior military techniques to defeat Qing belligerents, compelling the Chinese to grant favorable tariffs, trade concessions, and territory, including the transfer of Hong Kong to Great Britain. The 2 wars resulted in the Treaty of Tientsin on June 26, 1858, forcing China to pay reparations for the expenses of both wars, while expanding the number of ports open to European commerce. The treaty also legalized the opium trade, granting foreign traders and missionaries full rights to travel freely within China. And there you have it. Greed and substance abuse wins the opium wars. Today on The Daily Dose, get your nerd on with The Daily Dose and learn something new every day. Subscribe to The Daily Dose on YouTube or sign up for emails at dailydosenow.com. Today in The Daily Dose, Ben Franklin's Postal Service spawns an American Revolution. By the still tender age of 31, Ben Franklin had already built a prosperous business as a printer, shopkeeper, and publisher of the Pennsylvania Gazette, not to mention the author of the wildly successful Poor Richard's Almanac. In 1737, he was appointed postmaster of Philadelphia after British authorities removed his predecessor for failing to submit financial reports. Being a local postmaster didn't come with much pay, but it did allow Franklin to mail his newspaper to readers at no cost, making the Pennsylvania Gazette one of the colony's most successful publications. Comparable to how politicians and celebrities rely on platforms such as Twitter, Franklin used the mail for self-promotion of his many achievements, making the Founding Father one of the world's most admired Americans. Due to his meticulous record-keeping, Franklin was asked by his British overlords to manage Britain's colonial mail service from 1753 to 1774, allowing Franklin to supercharge a primitive courier system connecting the 13 fragmented colonies into an efficiency-driven organization that sped deliveries between Philadelphia and New York City to a mere 24 hours. Franklin's travels along the post roads of colonial America would inspire his revolutionary vision for how a new nation could thrive independently of Britain. But not even Franklin could imagine the pivotal role his postal service would bring to the American Revolution. By the early 1770s, Franklin's fellow patriots had organized underground communication networks, the Committees of Correspondence, followed by the Constitutional Post, that allowed the Founding Fathers to talk treason behind the backs of their British rulers. In 1775, 3 months after the battles of Lexington and Concord, and well before the Declaration of Independence was even signed, the Continental Congress turned the Constitutional Post into the Post Office of the United States, whose operations became the first, and for many average Americans, the most significant function of the newly formed government. James Madison and other Founding Fathers understood how the Post could support a fledgling democracy, delivering inexpensive newspapers and political pamphlets that shed light on British tax bills designed to pay back Britain after her defense of the colonies during the French and Indian Wars. Put simply, Franklin's efficient management of the world's first social media platform allowed like-minded Americans to join forces in their common desire for independence. And there you have it. Franklin's Postal Service spawns an American revolution. Today on the Daily Dose. If you like learning something new every day, subscribe to the Daily Dose on YouTube or sign up for emails at dailydosenow.com. Today on the Daily Dose, CRISPR explained. CRISPR is a new technology for changing the sequence of DNA in cells in a precise manner, which allows scientists to correct mutations that might otherwise cause diseases, allowing scientists to do a number of things that they were incapable of doing before. For example, they can study how diseases work by having two populations that are closely related to each other. CRISPR can then delineate how diseases spread from one population to the other. Scientists can now modify bacteria and algae to produce useful byproducts such as medicines or biofuels that work much like microscopic factories. CRISPR can modify foods to make seed stock disease or pest resistant in a way that is much more accurate and precise than previous methods of DNA manipulation. The way CRISPR works is by the action of a protein called Cas9 that functions like a molecular scalpel on DNA. The CRISPR-Cas9 system has an amazing ability to recognize a particular DNA sequence in a cell that might be malfunctioning, and then disable it by cutting or editing the DNA. For Cas9 to find the malfunctioning DNA sequence, scientists attach it to an RNA sequence that matches the DNA sequence they want to edit. Then they inject this RNA-Cas9 combination into the affected cell. It then hunts down the mutant DNA, a chemical reaction, to cut the strand right at the spot where it's malfunctioning. After that, they can sometimes insert the correct version of the gene for the cell to work properly again. And there you have it, CRISPR explained, today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, Lucky Lindy, the first man to cross the pond. Born in Detroit in 1902, Charles Lindbergh took up flying at the tender age of 20. A year later, he bought a surplus World War I Curtiss Jenny biplane and toured the country as a barnstorming stunt pilot. In 1924, he enrolled in the Army Air Service Flying School in Texas and graduated at the top of his class. He became an airmail pilot in 1926 and pioneered the route between St. Louis and Chicago. In 1926, French entrepreneur Raymond Ortegue reoffered a prize of $25,000 to the first aviator or aviators to fly nonstop across the Atlantic from New York to Paris, a flight of some 3,600 miles over open water. In response, Lindbergh convinced the St. Louis Chamber of Commerce to front the cost of the flight, setting a budget of $15,000 in support of Lindbergh's objective. Ryan Airlines Corporation of San Diego volunteered to build the Spirit of St. Louis, which proved to be little more than a single-engine gas tank with wings. The main fuel tank was placed in front of the cockpit, which cut off Lindbergh's forward vision other than the addition of a periscope. To cut down on weight, all non-essential instruments were removed, including the radio, gas gauges, night flying lights, navigation equipment, and a parachute. Bad weather delayed Lindbergh's transatlantic attempt for nearly a week, but on May 20th, 1927, the Spirit of St. Louis struggled to lift off from the muddy grass runway at Roosevelt Field, so overloaded with fuel that the plane barely cleared the telephone wires at the end of the runway. On May 21st, halfway across the pond, Lindbergh entered a fog bank as he struggled to stay awake, holding his eyelids open with his fingers. He later confessed that he hallucinated about ghosts passing through the cockpit. After 24 hours of flying, he spotted fishing boats and knew he was close to land. He called down to them which way to Ireland. When he landed at Le Bourget Aerodrome in Paris, Charles Lindbergh became an international celebrity, strengthening the notion that one man with the right amount of daring and ingenuity could have an enormous impact on the world. President Calvin Coolidge dispatched a warship to bring the hero home. Upon his arrival in New York, Lucky Lindy was given a ticker-tape parade before being presented with the Congressional Medal of Honor. And there you have it, Lucky Lindy, today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, Muhammad Ali. Born Cassius Clay on January 17, 1942, Muhammad Ali was an American professional boxer, activist, and philanthropist. Nicknamed the Greatest, he was widely regarded as one of the most significant and celebrated sports figures of the 20th century, and one of the greatest boxers of all time. Born and raised in Louisville, Kentucky, Ali began training as an amateur boxer at the tender age of 12. By the time he was 18, he won a gold medal in the light heavyweight division at the 1960 Summer Olympics, turning pro later that year. In 1964, 22-year-old Ali upset the 7-1 favorite Sonny Liston in a fight that stunned the boxing world. Just barely qualifying for the heavyweight division, Ali announced himself to the world as a first-rate trash talker in pre-fight interviews.
You want to lose your money, then bet on Sonny.
There might be sharpness, that might be all, ladies and gentlemen. Get up there. Get up in the ring. Come here, Ted. I'm the greatest thing that ever lived. I don't have a mark on my face, and I upset Sonny Liston, and I just turned 22 years old. I must be the greatest. I'm pretty. I'm a bad man. I shook up the world. I shook up the world. I shook up the world. You must listen to me. I am the greatest.
Don't we rumble? Float like a butterfly and sting like a bee. Ah, rumble, young man, rumble. Hey! That's what we're gonna do. We're gonna...
On April 28, 1967, citing his religious beliefs in opposition to the Vietnam War, Ali refused to be drafted into military service. He was arrested, found guilty of draft evasion, and stripped of his boxing titles. He spent the next 5 years in prison until he successfully appealed his case to the Supreme Court, which overturned his conviction in 1971. His refusal to fight an unjust war made him an icon of the counterculture generation opposed to the war in Southeast Asia. Muhammad Ali remains the only 3-time lineal champion of the heavyweight division, beating 21 heavyweight boxers to cement his place into the history books of sports. In his later years, Ali developed Parkinson's disease and was hospitalized on June 2, 2016, with what was first diagnosed as a respiratory illness. Although his condition was initially described as survival, he died the next day at age 74 due to underlying complications relating to septic shock. And there you have it, the life and times of Muhammad Ali, today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, the Great Pestilence. Rooted in Asia, Black Death or bubonic plague first arrived in Europe in October 1347, when 12 ships from the Black Sea docked at the Sicilian port of Messina. People gathered at the docks to welcome the new arrivals, only to discover that most of the mariners were dead, while others were covered in black boils that oozed blood and pus. Authorities immediately forced the ships to sail from port. But the Great Pestilence was injected into Europe despite the Sicilians' containment efforts. The symptoms of bubonic plague include fever and chill, severe headaches and malaise, nausea, vomiting, seizures, delirium, and death. The term bubonic derives from the ancient Greek word bubo, meaning swollen gland, or in the case of bubonic plague, swollen lymphatic glands. Buboes generally appear in the armpits and groin of their victim. According to chroniclers during the Black Death, other symptoms included petechia, or bruised purplish skin splotches on the chest, back, and neck. During the Great Pestilence, this condition became known as God's tokens, since petechiae always meant that the victim had a fatal case of the disease. Diarists also reported that victims who appeared to be on death's door from plague smelled like they were as well. Black Death was caused by the transmission of the Yersinia pestis bacteria from rats to humans, borne by the Xenopsilla cheops flea. Prior to the outbreak of plague, Europe experienced a period of torrential rains, which reduced crop yields and forced an overcrowding of fleas to hitch rides on rats, who in turn descended upon cities in search of a dwindling food supply. This tandem migration of a different sort of pestilence spelled disaster for the spread of bubonic plague. How many people died in the Great Pestilence can only be speculated. But for Europe, the most widely accepted mortality stands at a third of her population, or 25 million lives. In parts of Italy, England, and France, the death toll was much higher, upwards of 50 to 60%. Losses in the Middle East and North Africa also struck down a third of her people, while China lost nearly half. If plague were to erupt today under the same conditions as medieval Europe, Black Death would cost the lives of well over 2 billion innocent lives. And there you have it, the Great Pestilence, today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, Martin Luther King Jr.'s final speech. On Wednesday, April 3, 1968, the community of Memphis, Tennessee spent the day under siege by strong winds and violent thunderstorms. After a bomb threat had delayed his flight from Atlanta, Martin Luther King Jr. and his contemporaries from the Southern Christian Leadership Conference checked in at the Lorraine Hotel in advance of a sanitation workers' rally at the Mason Temple that night, followed by a planned protest march the following Monday. Doc, as he was affectionately known to his colleagues, checked into his usual room at the Lorraine, room 306, with his habitual roommate Ralph Abernathy at his side. Out on the rain-soaked streets, the Memphis police set up a dragnet around the hotel, doing what they could to protect the famed Nobel laureate and civil rights legend from untold threats by white racists intent on silencing MLK's message of nonviolent protest. Barely installed in room 306, 2 officers from the Memphis Sheriff's Department arrived to serve Dr. King with an injunction issued by the Fifth Circuit Court of Tennessee, indicating that next Monday's planned sanitation workers' march had been banned. Combined with the bomb threat, Doc asked Abernathy and Jesse Jackson to stand in for him at the Mason Temple that night, while he turned in early for some much-needed sleep. Hours later, Doc awakened to the sound of his hotel room phone, and when he answered it, Abernathy informed him that the overcapacity crowd at the temple refused to take no for an answer regarding a morale-boosting speech by the civil rights legend. In response, Doc dressed in a suit and cabbed over to the church for what would become his final speech before his life was unjustly ended the following day.
What we say to America is be true to what you said on paper. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest far right. So just as I say we aren't going to let any dogs or water hoses turn us around, we aren't going to let any injunction turn us around. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
The next day, stealing off with Abernathy for lunch at one of MLK's favorite fried catfish joints, Doc confessed to his friend that he hadn't prepared for last night's monumental speech, but rather he let the Holy Spirit guide his thoughts and words. 6 hours later, while departing the Lorraine Hotel for a planned dinner at a local reverend's home, Doc received the worst injustice when an assassin's bullet found its mark. And there you have it, MLK's final speech and the passing of a civil rights icon, today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, the Spanish flu of 1918. Nearly everyone, at least once in their life, has experienced an infectious episode of common influenza. Flu symptoms include headaches, nausea, fever and chills, muscle ache, general malaise, and sinus congestion. Known simply as the flu, influenza is a recurrent infectious disease caused by RNA viruses of the Orthomyxoviridae family of viral pathogens. Known as Spanish flu or La Gripa, in 1918, 3 waves of H1N1 spread throughout the world at a staggering pace. The majority of those afflicted by La Gripa recovered fully, but in some patients the disease worsened to pneumonia, against which modern medicine at the time had no viable defense. Victims of this lethal stage of infection developed a bluish cast to their faces, which would ultimately turn purple or brown. Once a victim's feet turned black, death was generally only hours away. Spanish flu invaded cities across the globe in an almost random fashion, hopscotching around the world without apparent logic or predictable demographic progression. Boston, Massachusetts. Freetown in Sierra Leone. Brest, France. In San Francisco, over 3,500 pneumonia cases were admitted to area hospitals, with over 900 fatalities. Everywhere in the United States, public gatherings were banned. Schools, theaters, churches, and businesses were shut down by public decree. Nearly everyone wore face masks, yet nothing seemed to arrest the spread of influenza. Considered the greatest single most demographic shock that mankind has ever experienced. In 2 years that Spanish flu ravaged the earth, 1/5 of the world's population became infected, with an estimated mortality of 50 to 100 million lives. In one devastating year, Spanish flu killed more people than Hitler, nuclear weapons, and all worldwide terrorist attacks combined. In the end, despite frantic efforts to unlock its etiology and devise an effective cure, Spanish flu disappeared from the human landscape as quickly as it had arrived. And there you have it, the Spanish flu of 1918, today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, the Code Talkers of World War II. Pioneered by the Cherokee and Choctaw people during World War I, the Code Talkers of World War II were an elite group of Native Americans who played a key role in the Pacific, European, and North African theaters of war. Fighting with the United States Marine Corps, the estimated 500 Code Talkers' primary mission was to encrypt and decrypt vital battlefield communications using their native languages, which left their Nazi and Japanese adversaries unable to eavesdrop on Allied communications, troop movements, and offensive strategies. While the majority of World War II Code Talkers came from the Navajo Nation, they also included soldiers from the Lakota, Meskwaki, Mohawk, Comanche, Tlingit, Hopi, Cree, and Crow people. By way of example, a total of 14 Comanche Code Talkers took part in the D-Day invasion at Normandy, employing a vocabulary of over 100 code terms from their native language. A tank was defined as a turtle, while a bomber was a pregnant airplane. A machine gun was a sewing machine, while Adolf Hitler was a crazy white man. On June 6, 1944, 2 Comanche Code Talkers were embedded with each regiment that landed at Utah Beach, while their counterparts were assigned to the 4th Infantry Division headquarters, where they decrypted codes radioed from the beachhead. Many were wounded during the D-Day offensive known as Overlord, although thankfully none were killed. The Code Talkers Recognition Act of 2008 was signed into law by President George W. Bush on November 15th of that same year, honoring each surviving member with a Congressional Gold Medal. The Code Talkers' work was a key factor in the victories at Iwo Jima and Saipan, along with several other major battles in the Pacific Theater. Credited with saving the lives of thousands of Allied personnel, The Code Talkers' encryption techniques comprise the only military code never to have been broken. And there you have it, the Code Talkers of World War II, today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, the D-Day invasion at Normandy. Codenamed Operation Overlord, but often referred to as D-Day, the June 6, 1944 invasion of 5 Normandy beachheads would prove to be the largest seaborne invasion in the history of human warfare. Confident that an Allied invasion attempt of Nazi-occupied Europe would come somewhere in the western seafronts facing Great Britain, from 1942 to 1944, Hitler built a coastal defense and fortification system known as the Atlantic Wall, which spanned 1,600 miles of coastline from Belgium to the northern border of Spain. In the months leading up to the invasion, the Allies conducted a substantial military deception plan known as Operation Bodyguard, designed to mislead the Germans as to the date and location of the main Allied landings. While the original D-Day invasion was set for June the 5th, bad weather forced General Dwight D. Eisenhower to delay the operation by 24 hours, which nearly triggered a further delay of 2 weeks, since the invasion planners had strict requirements that coincided with the phase of the moon and subsequent high tides associated with a full moon, conditions that aligned on only 2 days per month. The amphibious landings were preceded by extensive aerial and naval bombardment, followed by the landing of 24,000 airborne troops shortly after midnight on June 6. Allied infantry and armored divisions began landing on the coast of France at 6:30 that same morning, spanning a 50-mile swatch of Normandy beachheads known as Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. The men landed under heavy fire from Nazi gun emplacements overlooking the beachheads, which were strewn with landmines and metal tripods to further slow the Allied troop advances. Comprised of 8 Allied navies, the invasion fleet was made up of 6,939 vessels, including 1,213 warships, 4,126 landing craft, 736 ancillary craft, and 864 merchant vessels. Around 156,000 Allied soldiers and paratroopers landed at Normandy on June the 6th, while a total of 1.5 million troops would flood into Europe via the Normandy beachheads by the end of the week. 10,500 Allied troops would be killed, wounded, missing, or made prisoner of war on that first invasion day, while the Germans would suffer a nearly equal number of losses. And there you have it, Operation Overlord, today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, the Bonanza Kings. During the gold rush of 1849, only the most hardy of men crossed a rugged nation for untold riches waiting for them in California. When silver was discovered in current-day Virginia City, Nevada, only the hardiest of the 49ers made their way over the rugged terrain of the Sierra Nevada mountains in hope of striking it rich yet again. While Billy Ralston and his womanizing business partner William Sharon became the early dominant mine owners in the region, they would soon be unseated by 4 uneducated Irishmen who would collectively become known as the Bonanza Kings. While John Mackey and James Fair worked shoulder to shoulder with their miners, they partnered with San Francisco bartenders James Flood and William O'Brien, who opened their bar by pure chance next to the San Francisco Mining Exchange, where they captured insider knowledge about various silver mines when the traders came in for lunch. James Fair was the best miner of the group, and after the Consolidated Virginia Silver Mine exhausted what was commonly thought to be its last ounce of silver, Fair was convinced that the true mother lode of the Comstock lay much deeper than the Virginia City mine owners had plumbed. While Fair and Mackey started digging deeper in the mine, the bartenders quietly began buying up shares of Con Virginia stock as share prices plummeted from over $1,000 a share to under $50. Once the 4 Irishmen owned the lion's share of Con Virginia stock, they unearthed the largest single silver strike in world mining history, making the 4 immigrants some of the wealthiest men in the world. James Fair would go on to become a senator for the state of Nevada, unseating William Sharon as the two spent their millions to vie for power. Fair's wife would later divorce him on grounds of habitual adultery. He died at age 63, igniting a huge public scandal when his will mysteriously disappeared from the county clerk's office before any of the surviving children could read its contents. Soft-spoken and mild-mannered, William O'Brien became known as the Jolly Millionaire, freely confessing that he had neither taste nor talent for making money, prompting him to attribute his puzzling rise to affluence as an act of grasping onto rapidly ascending kites and simply holding on for dear life. After his death at age 52, a veritable conga line of women claimed to be the dead millionaire's wife, clogging the court system as they laid claims on his estate. James Flood would go on to build ever larger mansions around Northern California, including his Nob Hill home comprised of 42 rooms. Odd as it may seem, it was not the house itself that enthralled the citizens of San Francisco, but the block-long fence that surrounded the property. Known today as Flood's Brass Rail, its wealthy landlord employed a man full-time to polish the brass in much the same way that Flood had once maintained his rail at the Auction Lunch Saloon. While John Mackey preferred a simple life in San Francisco, his socially climbing wife set up lavish homes in London and Paris. Marie Mackey solidified her entrance into Parisian society by hosting a party for Ulysses S. Grant, while the ex-Civil War general was on his post-war world tour. To further her growing fame, Ludovic Halévy, a popular French novelist, published L'Abbé Constantine, a book about a fabulously rich American woman who tires of her life in Paris and moves to a rural mansion. The book became a mainstay for young Americans learning French, and the main character, Madame Scott, was clearly drawn from that of Marie Mackey. And there you have it, the Bonanza Kings, today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, Hoovervilles of the Great Depression. At the height of the Great Depression, when 1 in 4 eligible workers found themselves homeless and unemployed, hundreds of shantytown slums sprang up across the nation, housing hundreds of thousands of destitute Americans. Disillusioned citizens called them Hoovervilles, referring to the commonly held belief that Republican President Herbert Hoover was a do-nothing leader who passed responsibility for the rampant homeless epidemic onto local governments and charities. Homelessness was certainly present long before the Great Depression, making the condition a common sight in most American cities well before the Black Tuesday stock market crash of 1929. Most cities built municipal lodging houses for their homeless until the Great Depression exponentially increased demand for limited public housing. As a result, massive Hoovervilles formed around soup kitchens, usually trespassing on private lands, yet tolerated or ignored out of dire necessity. Some Hooverville residents possessed construction skills, allowing them to build their houses out of stone, but the vast majority resorted to building their residences out of wood from crates, cardboard, scraps of metal, or whatever materials they could find. When a Hooverville formed near the reservoir in New York Central Park, the residents were hastily evicted by the police. As the Depression wore on, however, public sentiment became more sympathetic, and in July 1931, a judge suspended the sentences of 22 unemployed men sleeping in Central Park, giving each of them $2 out of his own pocket. "We work hard to keep clean," one of the men said to the judge, "because that's important. I never lived like this before." In 1932, Democratic presidential candidate Franklin D. Roosevelt campaigned for the forgotten man at the bottom of the economic pyramid. After his election to the White House, at his direction, Congress passed a series of emergency measures known as the New Deal for the American people, forging a new government agency known as the Works Progress Administration, or WPA. The program would grow to employ 8.5 million people and spend over $11 billion as it transformed the nation's infrastructure by putting Americans back to work. And there you have it, Hoovervilles of the Great Depression, today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, black blizzards and the Dust Bowl. Coinciding with the Great Depression of the 1930s, another worst hard time, the Dust Bowl was a period of severe dust storms that fiercely damaged the ecology and agriculture of the American and Canadian prairies, caused by a protracted drought and the failure by farmers to apply dryland farming techniques to prevent wind erosion. Despite near desert-like topography, in the decades following the Civil War, farmers flocked to the region under the false assumption that rain would follow the plow. The region prospered in the first 3 decades of the 20th century due to advances in farming such as the mechanized tractor, improved irrigation techniques, and an unprecedented period of abundant rainfall. From 1900 to 1920, the amount of farmland in the region doubled, and from 1925 to 1930, the amount of cultivated land nearly tripled. During these same periods, farmers employed techniques that depleted nutrient-rich topsoil that led to widespread erosion. Heavy plowing led to the eradication of deep-rooted grasses that held the prairies intact, followed by a severe drought that afflicted the region for the entirety of the 1930s. The heart of the Dust Bowl was comprised of an approximate 100 million acres, encompassing the panhandles of Texas and Oklahoma, western Kansas, and large swatches of eastern New Mexico and Colorado. As the drought intensified, lung-choking dust storms became known as black blizzards. The worst of these fell on April 14, 1935, when it hit Beaver, Oklahoma around 4 p.m., Boise City around 5:15, and Amarillo, Texas at 7:20. Avis Carlson was caught in the midst of this most deadly black blizzard. People caught in their own yards grope for their doorsteps. Cars come to a standstill, for no light in the world can penetrate this swirling murk. The nightmare is deepest during the storms, but on the occasional bright day and the usual gray day, we cannot shake from it. We live with the dust, we eat it, we sleep with it. We watch it strip us of possessions and the hope of possessions. Intense efforts were made to correct the problem, including crop rotations, contour plowing, and terracing. The Civilian Conservation Corps planted more than 200 million trees from Texas to Canada in an attempt to block the wind and hold the soil in place. Unable to pay mortgages or grow crops, the Dust Bowl forced tens of thousands of poverty-stricken families to abandon their farms. Known as Okies, these destitute people migrated en masse to California and other states, only to discover that the Great Depression had rendered these regions only mildly better than the conditions they were forced to flee. And there you have it, the Dust Bowl and black blizzards, today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, the great San Francisco earthquake of 1906. On the morning of April 18, 1906, a massive 7.9 magnitude earthquake shook the city of San Francisco, California, delivering a punch 12,000 times more powerful than the bomb exploded over Hiroshima. While the quake lasted less than a minute, it managed to sever gas and water mains, which would soon devastate and burn down nearly 500 city blocks. The earthquake and subsequent fire killed an estimated 3,000 people and left half of the city's 400,000 residents homeless and destitute. To this day, the earthquake and subsequent inferno remains the greatest natural disaster suffered by a North American city. Around 9 a.m., someone living in the Hayes district kindled a fire to cook breakfast, not knowing their chimney had been compromised. Nicknamed the Ham and Eggs Fire, by noon, the resulting conflagration threatened the entire city. Ruptured gas mains quickly spread the fire into full pandemic, while ruptured water mains made it impossible for fire brigades to combat the spreading flames. Among the many landmarks lost was the Palace Hotel, built by Silver Kings Billy Ralston and William Sharon. Enrico Caruso, the famous singer, was staying at the hotel and was forced to flee for his life. Palace bartenders gave away expensive bottles of wine, knowing the hotel would soon burn to the ground. The worst casualties were south of Market, where Ralston and Sharon had used their money and bulldozers to reclaim usable land from the marshy shores of San Francisco Bay. The worst loss of life in the south of Market district was the collapse of the Valencia Hotel, where upwards of 80 people lost their lives. At 2:30 p.m., the last telegraph was sent from San Francisco before the last of the lines were severed by catastrophe.
2:30 p.m., the city's practically ruined by fire. It's within half a block of us. The call building is burned out entirely. The examiner building just fell in a heap. There's fire all around us and in every direction. Destruction by earthquake. San Francisco's gone. Something frightful. They're blowing up standing buildings that are in the path of flames by dynamite. No water to fight the fire. It's awful. I want to get out of here or be blown up so I can go on to heaven.
While half the city lived in tents set up in open spaces and parks, it would take 4 years for the city to rebuild from one of the worst natural disasters the world has ever known. And there you have it, the Great San Francisco Earthquake of 1906, today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, the Codebreakers of World War II. Born in London in 1912, brilliant mathematician Alan Turing studied at both Cambridge and Princeton before joining the British government Code and Cipher School at Bletchley Park in Buckinghamshire, where top-secret work was carried out to decipher the military codes used by the Axis nations. The main focus of Turing's work at Bletchley was to crack the Enigma code, a type of enciphering machine used by the German armed forces to send secure messages between troop field commands as well as naval vessels at sea. Although Polish mathematicians had worked out how to read Enigma messages and had shared their knowledge with the British before the Nazis rolled into Poland, the Germans increased security measures at the outbreak of war by changing their cipher system daily. This made the task of breaking the code exponentially more difficult. Along with fellow codebreaker Gordon Welchman, Turing played a key role in breaking the Nazis' code by developing a machine called the bomb, which significantly reduced the work of breaking the ever-changing German code. Turing then went on to decipher the more complex Enigma code used by the German Navy, whose U-boats were inflicting heavy losses on Allied shipping. German naval Enigma messages were able to be read from 1941 onwards because of Turing's work, prompting Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower to comment after the war that breaking the Enigma code was a decisive part of the Allies' victory over the Germans. Before the war, Turing invented a hypothetical computing device that became known as the Universal Turing Machine, and after the war's conclusion, he continued to build on his earlier work, eventually publishing a design for what he called an automatic computing engine, a clear forerunner to the modern computer of today. In 1952, Turing was arrested for homosexuality and found guilty of gross indecency. The conviction was overturned when he agreed to undergo chemical castration. In 1954, he was found dead from cyanide poisoning, which was later ruled a suicide. And there you have it, the Codebreakers of World War II, today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, Alan Shepard, the first American in space. A graduate of the Naval Academy at Annapolis, Alan Shepard saw action in the Navy during World War II, becoming a naval aviator in 1946 and a test pilot in 1950. Selected as one of the original Mercury 7 astronauts in 1959, Shepard proved to be the definition of the right stuff when he piloted his Mercury Redstone 3 rocket into space on May 5, 1961. Before ascending up to the capsule, Shepard paused to admire his massive rocket, later recalling that he suddenly realized he would never see the beast again. Flight delays rolled on for more than 4 hours until he finally asked for a bathroom break. Denied by the flight director, Shepard was encouraged by ground personnel to simply let it go. He later recalled that he was completely dry by liftoff due to the wicking nature of his cotton undergarments and the capsule's environment of 100% oxygen. Named Freedom 7 by Shepard himself, his 15-minute flight would take him 150 miles up into space where he was able to fully control the pitch, roll, and yaw of his spacecraft. Upon his return to Earth, Shepard became an instant national celebrity, flying into space a mere 3 weeks after Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first man in space. Designated as the commander of the first crewed Gemini flight, he was grounded in 1963 due to Meniere's disease, an inner ear condition that causes extreme bouts of dizziness and nausea. After the ailment was surgically corrected in 1969, Shepard commanded Apollo 14, becoming the 5th and oldest man to walk on the moon. One of the crew had smuggled the head of a 6-iron in one of their utility pockets of their spacesuits, and when Shepard attached the head to a shaft-like piece of the lunar lander, he took 4 one-handed swings on the moon due to the restrictive nature of his spacesuit. While the record for the longest golf shot on Earth is held by Mike Austin at 515 yards, when Shepard finally connected on his final shot, it is estimated that the ball traveled upwards of 1 mile, or 1,760 yards, through the moon's reduced gravitational pull. On the moon, anyway. We're going to need a bigger course. And there you have it, Alan Shepard, the first American in space. Today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, the Battle of Little Bighorn. Known by Plains Indians as the Battle of the Greasy Grass, the Battle of Little Bighorn was an armed engagement between combined forces of the Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho Indians against the 7th Cavalry Regiment of the United States Army. Part of the Great Sioux War of 1876, the battle took place along the Little Bighorn River within the Crow Indian Reservation of the Montana Territory. On June 26, the ensuing battle would prove to be an overwhelming victory for the Indians, as well as what would become known as Custer's Last Stand. Setting out on a spring campaign to engage the Indians anywhere they could be found, Colonel John Gibbons' 6 companies left Fort Ellis in western Montana Territory on March 30th, intending to patrol the Yellowstone River. Brigadier General George Crook's 10 companies moved north from Fort Fetterman in the Wyoming Territory on May 29th, marching toward the Powder River area, while Brigadier General Alfred Terry's 12 companies departed westward from Fort Abraham Lincoln in the Dakota Territory. Lieutenant Colonel George Custer's 12 companies and a Gatling gun detachment departed westward from Fort Abraham Lincoln on May 17th, accompanied by teamsters and packers with 150 wagons and a large contingent of pack mules. At sunrise on June 25th, Custer's scouts reported a massive pony herd near the Little Bighorn River, along with signs of an Indian village. Not wanting the Indians to flee before a fight, on the morning of June 26, Custer decided to attack without waiting for reinforcements. With an impending sense of doom, Custer's Crow Indian scout Half Yellowface prophetically warned Custer that you and I are going home today by a road we do not know. Expecting only around 800 belligerent warriors, Major Marcus Reno was first to attack the village, until his line was overrun by upwards of 2,000 warriors led by Crazy Horse and Chief Gall. 29 troopers were killed during the retreat, while another 15 men went missing. As for Custer's bad day, the precise details are largely conjectural, since none of the American combatants would survive. Later pieced together by Indian accounts, Custer's force of 210 men had been engaged by the Lakota and Northern Cheyenne about 3.5 miles to the north of Reno's fallback position. After the battle was over, troops came to recover the bodies, discovering that the dead soldiers had been stripped of their clothing and ritually mutilated. The dead were hastily buried where they fell, while Custer's body was discovered with 2 gunshot wounds, one to his left chest and the other to his left temple. Some Lakota oral histories assert that Custer committed suicide to avoid capture and subsequent torture, though this is usually discounted by historians since the wounds were inconsistent with his known right-handedness. And there you have it, the Battle of Little Bighorn, today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space. Born in the village of Klushino near Gazatsk, a city that would later bear his name, Yuri Gagarin flew for the Soviet Air Forces before being selected along with 5 other cosmonauts for the Soviet space program. As the Cold War and subsequent space race escalated between the United States and the USSR, Gagarin would stun the world by beating the Americans into space. On April 12, 1961, Gagarin boarded his Vostok 1 space capsule for a successful liftoff. He orbited the Earth for 108 minutes before re-entering Earth's atmosphere, ejecting from his capsule at 23,000 feet for a parachute drop safely down to Earth. Gagarin became an instant national hero and was awarded the Soviet Union's highest medal for valor. Beginning in 1962, the Soviet Union began celebrating the day of Gagarin's flight as Cosmonautics Day, which was later renamed International Day of Human Spaceflight. The flight would be his sole trip into space, although he did serve as backup crew for the ill-fated Soyuz 1 spaceflight, which ended in a fatal crash, killing his friend and fellow cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov. Fearing for the life of their national hero, Soviet officials permanently banned Gagarin from further spaceflights. He died in 1968 when his MiG-15 training jet crashed near the town of Kurtsak, taking the life of Gagarin and flight instructor Vladimir Zarogin. And there you have it, Yuri Gagarin, today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, Edmund Hillary, the first man to climb Mount Everest. After serving in World War II as a navigator for the Royal New Zealand Air Force, Edmund Hillary dedicated himself to his love of mountaineering, including the yet unachieved crown jewel of mountain climbing, a successful ascent of Mount Everest. In 1949, a long-standing route to the summit of Everest was closed by Chinese-controlled Tibet, while the Nepalese side of the mountain only allowed 1 or 2 expeditions a year. Selected by the 9th British Expedition to Everest, team leader John Hunt tapped out Hillary to join the attempt. The expedition totaled over 400 people, including 362 porters, 20 Sherpa guides, and over 10,000 pounds of gear. The expedition set up base camp in March of 1953, working up the mountain to establish their final camp at South Col at 25,900 feet. On March 26, 2 climbers attempted the final ascent until their oxygen systems failed less than 300 vertical feet from the summit. Hunt then directed Hillary and Sherpa guide Tenzing Norgay to follow where the last 2 had failed. The 2 pitched a tent at 27,900 feet on May 28th, while their 3-man support team returned down the mountain. The following morning, wearing 30-pound packs, the 2 climbers attempted the final ascent, until a 40-foot ice face approaching the summit nearly turned them back. Known today as the Hillary Step, Hillary later wrote that he noticed a crack between the rock and the snow sticking to the east face. He crawled inside and wiggled and jammed his way to the top. Tenzing followed behind him as Hillary chopped footholds for the 2 men to ascend the forbidden face. Then he saw that the ridge ahead dropped away to the north, while above him stood a snow dome. A few more whacks with his ice axe, and suddenly Hillary and Tenzing stood on the top of the world. Tenzing left chocolates at the summit as an offering to Hindu gods, while Hillary left a crucifix given to him by John Hunt. Their descent down the mountain was a treacherous one, since drifting snow had covered their tracks. When they finally made their way down to South Col, the first person they met was George Low. "Well, George," said Hillary, "we knocked the bastard off." Hillary would later go on to reach the South Pole in 1958, followed by the North Pole in 1985 in the company of Neil Armstrong, the first man to walk on the moon. Hillary would be the first person to reach both poles, as well as the successful ascent of Everest. And there you have it, Edmund Hillary, the first man at the top of the world, today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, a shaky grand opening for the happiest place on Earth. Disneyland was the result of Walt Disney's vision to make a theme park that captured the illusionary wonders found in his movies, as well as a place where parents could have just as much fun as their children. Disney started planning his park in the 1940s, while his overriding theme had morphed several times before construction began in 1954. Originally, Disneyland was to be called Mickey Mouse Park, and if he had kept that vision for a mouse-centric experience, his final product would have been drastically different than the Disneyland we've come to know. Despite his evolving concepts for the park, in Disney's mind anyway, Disneyland had to be totally perfect, including no potential glimpses at buildings in the surrounding city of Anaheim that existed outside its theme park. In other words, Disney insisted that nothing should be allowed to break the magic and illusionary wonder he had set out to create. Disneyland opened on July 17, 1955, exactly 1 year and a day after construction first began. Opening day guests were by invitation only, including celebrities, members of the press, friends, family, and Disney VIPs. There was a total of around 11,000 invited guests, but the invitations themselves soon leaked to the outside world. Counterfeit tickets were sold illegally, and one man even set up a ladder and charged $5 a person for desperate would-be parkgoers to scale the fence. Over 28,000 people entered Disneyland that day, a number that both Disneyland and the city of Anaheim were completely unprepared for. Traffic was backed up for several miles outside the park, and the Disney parking lot soon reached capacity. Problems were magnified when a plumber strike turned off all the water to every drinking fountain on the unusually hot 100-plus degree day, while every Disneyland restaurant ran out of food and drinks within hours. The heat also made the freshly laid masonry asphalt turn spongy, making walking particularly treacherous for women in high heels. Several of the rides malfunctioned, and a gas leak prompted Adventureland, Frontierland, and Fantasyland to be evacuated. Despite these opening day glitches, Disneyland would open to the general public the following day, welcoming upwards of 50,000 visitors into the park, who had begun amassing at the main gates as early as 2 a.m. in the morning. Within its first 2 months of operations, Disneyland proved to be an overwhelming success, welcoming more than 1 million visitors to the happiest place on earth.
We've made a bum out of Barnum today, but we've got to go.
I know, but I just want to say a word of thanks to all the artists and the workers and everybody that helped make this dream come true.
Let's go into Fantasyland and have some fun.
Let's go.
Goodbye, folks.
And there you have it, a shaky grand opening for Disneyland. Today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, the passing of FDR. Serving an unprecedented 4 terms in office, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt had guided the American nation through the darkest days of the Great Depression, as well as through the majority of World War II.
It is my resolve and yours to build up our armed defenses.
On April 12, 1945, in what would become the final days of the war, FDR passed away at his retreat in Warm Springs, Georgia, leaving Vice President Harry S. Truman in charge of a nation deep in conflict. Roosevelt sat in his living room with his 2 cousins and Lucy Mercer, the later having resumed an extramarital affair with the president. While artist Elizabeth Chalmatoff painted his portrait, at 1 p.m. the president suddenly complained of a terrific pain in the back of his head, collapsing moments later into an unconscious heap, the victim of a massive cerebral aneurysm. Back at the White House, after Eleanor Roosevelt was given the news, she met with Vice President Truman, who had not yet been told. A calm and collected Eleanor said, "Harry, the president is dead," to which he replied, "Is there anything I can do for you?" Eleanor replied, "Harry, is there anything we can do for you? For you are the one in trouble now." Overseas, American servicemen and women were made numb by the news, for the majority of the young fighters had known no other president for the entirety of their lives. As FDR's funeral train rolled across the southern countryside, people thronged for a last farewell to their wartime president. In Washington, D.C., FDR's mortal remains were paraded in honor to the Capitol, where he was to lay in state. After the formal national ceremonies were over, he was buried in his hometown of Hyde Park, New York. Following the only 4-term presidency in American history, Congress passed the 22nd Amendment, which limited a sitting president to no more than 2 terms. The amendment was passed on February 27, 1951. And there you have it, the passing of FDR, today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, the Kon-Tiki expedition. In 1947, Norwegian adventurer and writer Thor Heyerdahl set out on a trans-Pacific passage in a balsa wood sailing raft named Kon-Tiki, sailing from South America to the Polynesian Islands. Named after the Incan god Viracocha, for whom Kon-Tiki was said to be a nickname used by early Incans, Heyerdahl and 5 other explorers set sail to prove that natives from South America could well have settled Polynesia in pre-Columbian times, employing rafts similar to Kon-Tiki. At the time of the expedition, scholarly wisdom insisted that people from Southeast Asia had arrived from the west to first populate Polynesia. But Heyerdahl meant to prove them wrong. Using only materials and technologies available to South Americans at the estimated time of seaward migration, Heyerdahl would go down in history as the first person to successfully dispute the Asian Basin migration theory. Using illustrations drawn by Spanish conquistadors of Peruvian seafaring rafts of the time, Heyerdahl and his crew built Kon-Tiki in Callao, Peru. On April 28, 1947, the crew, including one Spanish-speaking green parrot, set sail from Callao on a 101-day journey covering 4,300 miles, until Kon-Tiki smashed into a reef at Raiatea Atoll near Tahiti on August 7, 1947. The mast and cabin were reduced to flotsam, but miraculously the great balsa wood logs that made up the main body of the raft held firm. The crew managed to salvage some of their equipment, including a high-frequency radio transmitter. Within hours, the world knew they were safe, as well as triumphantly successful. While a new mast was cut and rigged for the last leg push to their original planned destination, Heyerdahl's crash landing on Raiatea stands to this day as possible proof that ancient South Americans may well have been the original people to populate the Polynesian islands. And there you have it, the Kon-Tiki expedition, today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, VE Day. Following 6 years of bloody warfare, the Allies' punishing air and ground offensive at long last broke the back of the Nazi war machine. Heavy air attacks gained superiority over the German Luftwaffe, while repeated attacks on German oil refineries stopped the Nazis' mechanized ground advances in all fronts of the war in Europe. In March and April of 1945, Germany was in endgame as the Soviets closed in on the German capital of Berlin. On April 30th, Hitler and some of his top aides committed suicide, all but cementing the final collapse of the once dominant Nazi regime. On May the 8th, after the Allies accepted Germany's unconditional surrender of its armed forces, Allied nations erupted in mass celebration as the war in Europe came to a close. More than 1 million people celebrated on city streets throughout Great Britain, while crowds amassed in London's Trafalgar Square and up the Mall to Buckingham Palace, where King George VI and Queen Elizabeth joined Prime Minister Winston Churchill on a palace balcony, whipping the crowds into a triumphant high note. The future Queen Elizabeth II and her sister Princess Margaret were allowed to wander incognito among the amassing crowds, taking in the frenzy of celebration like average women on the street. Coinciding with Harry Truman's 61st birthday, the sitting American president dedicated the victory to the memory of his predecessor, Franklin D. Roosevelt, who had died less than a month earlier from a catastrophic cerebral hemorrhage. As American cities erupted in celebration, by the end of the day, Truman confessed that the victory made it his most memorable birthday to date. In France, after years of Nazi occupation, the liberated French took to the streets in orderly jubilation, fully aware that better days were finally here to stay. While most celebrants felt the elation of victory in Europe, both Churchill and Truman tempered their citizens with the weighing truth that war against Japan had not yet been won. In his radio address on VE Day, Churchill told the British people that we may allow ourselves a brief period of rejoicing, but Japan remains unsubdued. In America, Truman's May 8th birthday broadcast said that the fall of the Nazis was a victory only halfway won. And there you have it, VE Day, today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, the fall of Saigon. On Tuesday, April 29, 1975, the usually crowded streets of Saigon were empty except for military personnel and ambulances. The attack by North Vietnamese forces at Tan Son Nhat Airport the day before has left the city in a 24-hour lockdown. With communist forces pressing in on downtown Saigon, the order to evacuate American nationals and South Vietnamese sympathizers was given. The original plan was to bus the evacuees to Tan Son Nhat Airport until it too came under fire by the communist building offensive. Journalists filming the air attacks witnessed a North Vietnamese helicopter go down by the presidential palace. At least 10 people died in the crash. American Ambassador Graham Martin took personal control of the situation. Amidst tremendous confusion and a total breakdown in military protocol, a steady procession of helicopters began landing within the relative safety of the walled American Embassy compound. Frightened civilians were airlifted to the American aircraft carriers Hancock and Midway, waiting some 40 miles offshore, ferried by a dedicated task force of some 80 American helicopters. Many of the surviving evacuees recalled that the most unnerving part was waiting for a ride to safety, all the while hearing artillery fire in the near distance, which only amplified their fears that the airlift would suddenly come to an end should the communists overtake the city. Besides the 80 American helicopters shuttling people to safety, South Vietnamese helicopter pilots flew their families to safety aboard the carriers as well, but lacking the space on the flight decks to stow their aircraft, the pilots were forced to ditch in the ocean or have their ships pushed into the sea. In all, approximately 7,000 people, most of them Vietnamese, were airlifted to safety during the 12-hour operation known as Frequent Wind. Desperate Vietnamese who failed to make the cut stayed at the embassy gates well into the night, desperately appealing for a Hail Mary last-minute evacuation. But for them, there was to be no mercy from the impending communist takeover. As the last of the Marines took to the rooftop of the embassy in hopes of their own Hail Mary evacuation, North Vietnamese tanks and troop carriers rolled into the city. The last of the Marines were finally airlifted from the rooftop, just as the communists stormed the compound gate. And there you have it, the fall of Saigon, today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, the end of Prohibition. Ratified by Congress on January 29, 1919, the National Prohibition Act gave state and local authorities the right to enforce the prohibition of alcohol. The temperance movement had been growing during the first 2 decades of the 20th century, under the common rallying cry that the consumption of alcohol was the primary cause of most crime in America. But as the 1920s unfolded, prohibition had an opposite effect. Prohibition opened lucrative doors for organized crime, where the production and distribution of alcohol became the mainstay of their business model. Prohibition proved difficult and expensive to enforce. As the 20s roared on, repeal groups gained an uncanny amount of support. After the stock market crash of 1929, the push to legalize alcohol was seen as a financial stimulus to the economy. Democratic presidential candidate Franklin D. Roosevelt quickly used it to his advantage against incumbent Herbert Hoover.
I call definite attention to the fact that just as soon as the Democratic platform pledge is enacted into a law modifying the Volstead Act,
After winning the White House, FDR repealed the 18th Amendment within 30 days of taking office, and on March 22, 1933, FDR signed the Beer and Wine Revenue Act, legalizing the sale of alcohol, provided the content was under 3.2%. The act would be followed by the 21st Amendment, which was ratified by the states on May 5, 1933, making Prohibition a thing of the past. And there you have it, the end of Prohibition, today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, the U-2 spy plane incident, May 1st, 1960. At 6:20 in the morning, Sunday, May 1st, 1960, Francis Gary Powers taxied onto the runway at Peshawar Air Base in Pakistan. Engineered to fly at 70,000 feet with a range of 7,000 miles, Powers flew his U-2 spy plane into Soviet airspace for his 28th mission. Flying in radio silence, Powers was scheduled to pass over the Hindu Kush range of the Himalayas into the southern USSR, passing over a 2,900-mile swatch of Soviet territory. A tense 9-hour flight into enemy terrain. Over Sverdlovsk, he felt a violent shudder of his aircraft just as he lost control as the plane leaned into a spin, parachuted into Soviet territory, where he was swiftly made a prisoner of war. Initially, U.S. authorities acknowledged the incident as a loss of a civilian weather research aircraft operated by NASA, but were forced to admit the mission's true purpose when a few days later the Soviet government produced the captured pilot and parts of the U-2 plane, including photographs of Soviet military bases taken during the mission. Powers was convicted of espionage and sentenced to 3 years of imprisonment plus 7 years of hard labor, but was released 2 years later on February 10, 1962, during a prisoner exchange for Soviet officer Rudolf Abel. Abel had been arrested